It's commendable how they're able to craft such morally ambiguous situations like this, with little to no dialogue, when other games struggle to do the same thing using so many more resources. If you like, you can ease her suffering by giving her more humanity to level up her covenant. Each time her covenant levels up, her limbs will move around a little more energetically to show that she's getting better. The book you can buy from Eingi is a list of people who have donated the most humanity to her. Unfortunately, these sorts of things are always rendered useless by cheaters because, as we all know, using exploits to get yourself to the top of a meaningless leaderboard is the definition of fun. The egg bearers here can infect you with their own eggs, which makes you more susceptible to fire and halves the amount of souls you receive. Basically, you're sharing half of your souls with the creature in the egg. If it absorbs a lot of souls, it grows, and eventually it changes your kick attack to a biting attack instead. Sadly, this doesn't infect other players if you do it online, which I think is a bit strange, especially since it would be so hard to land. I suppose it's possible they wanted to avoid some sort of situation where players who are always dueling would be infected by eggs all the time. There's a lot of bosses to get through in this area, and first up it's Ceaseless Discharge. As far as we know, the witches of Izalith were all women except for Ceaseless Discharge. The description on the orange charred ring, which we'll find later, gives us his backstory. It says, "Since his sores were inflamed by lava from birth, his witch sisters gave him this special ring." From the sounds of it, he's been in pain since the moment he was born, so they made this ring to try and counteract that. At some point he dropped the ring, possibly when he was transformed into a demon, so his pain now must be quite severe. He's watching over the clothes of Quilana, possibly because he misses her, but she's actually still alive and can be found in Blighttown if you have a highly ascended pyromancy flame. Some of her dialogue lets us know that the mishap which caused the demons to be created happened at least 1,000 years ago. In other words, Ceaseless Discharge has probably been like this for 1,000 years or more. In all of Dark Souls, he may have suffered more than anyone else, which is really saying something. The Demon Ruins Onwards unfortunately houses some of the worst bosses on offer, and Ceaseless Discharge is no exception. He's just too large to make for a satisfying fight, since you're just awkwardly trying to dodge his massive limbs and wail away on them. Instead of doing any of that, I'll be using a little trick to kill him instantly. If you lure him back to the fog door, he'll jump towards the ledge you're on and you can knock him off it to finish the fight straight away. This in turn lowers the lava so we can proceed to the next section. It's here that we have the return of the Taurus and Capra demons from the start as regular enemies. Out in the open like this, the Capra demons aren't so bad, you just have to be careful to fight them one at a time. On this approach here down to the series of Capras, you can see the Centipede demon hanging on the wall. You can actually see several bosses before you go into their arenas. The Moonlight Butterfly and the Iron Golem are two other examples. This one is especially interesting though because it's kind of camouflaged against the wall. You can get right up to it and it isn't even the next boss that you fight anyway. I didn't notice it on my first playthrough, and I find little things like this make repeat playthroughs that much more rewarding. The centipedes in the walls here are very similar in shape to the larvae inside the eggs, so I think that's probably what they grow into. I suppose it is possible they could mature into something else entirely though. These guys have some corrosive attacks which degrades your equipment. I'm kind of surprised we don't see corrosive stuff more often in these games. The durability mechanic takes so long for it to take effect that it's really just a very long-term punishment for forgetting to keep your equipment in shape. It's just one of those things that's used to pull you into the game world a little bit more. It's not really meant to be a particularly satisfying gameplay mechanic in and of itself. That said, I do think a few more corrosive enemies in the game could have incentivized players to have a few more weapons on hand, or otherwise just made the durability system that little bit more interesting. I suppose if there's any game where they're justified in shying away from corrosive attacks, it would be Dark Souls though, because of the interconnected world and the lack of warping. It would be pretty harsh if it was easy for the player to run out of useful equipment before they can get themselves out of the area. If you want to get the Chaos Ember placed here, you have to make your way past a lot of these worm things. It can be pretty tedious to kill them all, and it's just an optional area, so normally I just ignore them since I don't need the item. However, I am dedicated to the task at hand, so this time I suffered through just to grab it. I don't actually have anything to say about it, I just wanted to let you all know how much I suffer on your behalf. The next area is where you can open a shortcut to Lost Izalith if you're a Chaos Servant. Along the walls there are little humanity-shaped slots here with flames carved around them. This just goes to show that fire and humanity have always been linked together. I'm only speculating here, but I find these holes to be quite ominous. I mean, they could have easily depicted the same thing without having to actually carve a hole in the wall. So I wouldn't be surprised if people have actually been put inside these and burned for whatever reason. Perhaps it was part of whatever ritual the Witch of Izalith tried to perform when she wanted to copy the first flame. Chaos Pyromancy scales with humanity, so there's some basis for this even in the gameplay mechanics. Next up we have the Demon Fire Sage. This is the third time we've fought this boss, so I'm not even going to pretend I have anything interesting to say about it. It's a repeat, it's pretty boring, and we're just going to acknowledge that and move on. We have a lot of bad bosses to get through here. Right after this boss, there's an elevator which leads back up to the Fair Lady. They cheat a little bit with this elevator since it's down here even though it was up earlier on. They could have used a similar system to the magic lifts in the Royal Wood with the 2 activation buttons instead. I think the reason they did it this way is because they wanted to avoid having a hole in the floor after the Quelaag fight. First of all, since it would be a potential hazard right after ringing the second bell, but also because it ruins the surprise that there's an area below here. I know the Demon Ruins and Lost Izalith are some of the weaker areas, but I still think it's impressive that there's so many places to visit and that you keep just going further and further down past the point where you think you should be able to go. The later areas of the game tend to be less interconnected than the earlier ones, but Izalith actually has a couple of shortcuts, so at least that's something going for it. The Centipede Demon can be skipped if you have the shortcut open, but unfortunately I don't. This one is immune to fire damage, and that's probably why it's placed here. Pyromancers are the ones with the most to gain by being a Chaos Servant, so they're the most likely people to have the shortcut open. This gives them an easy way to circumvent a boss they might otherwise struggle with quite a lot. Personally, this is one of my least favourite bosses. It has very random and flaily attack animations which I don't think make for a particularly satisfying fight. I also think it has some of the worst hitboxes on offer, so that certainly doesn't help matters either. Killing this boss grants the orange charred ring I mentioned a few minutes ago, which allows you to walk across lava fields. It's easy to see how the interconnected worlds of Dark Souls might take its inspiration from the likes of Metroid. In fact, there's even a power-up in Super Metroid which allows you to cross through hot rooms, very much like the orange charred ring. The traversal in the Souls games isn't as complex though. You don't really jump around much or anything like that, you basically just walk or run from one location to another. That's why it mostly has to rely on gates and lifts to accomplish what other games might do with power-ups instead. This gives the Souls games a very grounded tone which I really enjoy, but I think this orange charred ring was a great opportunity to branch out into different forms of exploration. They don't really take advantage of it though. There's an area just before this where you can use the ring to collect another ember, but that's about it. They probably wanted to avoid too much backtracking, but I think it could have been rewarding to have a couple of other small areas with some lava that the player could return to and use the ring to find something new. They wouldn't have to sacrifice the world design to accomplish this or anything, they just needed a small amount of lava to block the player from getting into another area. One nice little bit of trivia about this ring is if you kick something while you have it equipped, it burns the enemy. I only found this out recently myself when I accidentally kicked a skeleton, and it makes me wonder how many other little things there are like that I might not have found yet. It's not a particularly useful effect, but I love little things like that nonetheless. Anyway, we're through most of the boring bosses, but we still need to do Izalith itself. Watching Lost Izalith come into view was one of the moments that really made me fall in love with this game. Ultimately though, this area falls into the trap of many open world style games where it just has a relatively flat and boring plane you can walk around and pick up items. The enemy types and the lava certainly don't help, but I think it's the flatness of this place which sticks out to me the most. In a way though, it's almost good to have this here, at least just for comparison's sake, because it does go to show how on point the level design in Dark Souls normally is. It may not make for satisfying gameplay, but even as one of the most bland sections to play through, it still has that handcrafted feel which I find tends to be missing from a lot of large RPGs. A large part of this is the architecture, which is very strikingly different from the other areas. Much of Dark Souls has a sort of medieval Europe influence to it, but this seems to be more like an ancient Asian temple. It gives you the immediate impression that this is a very different culture from the one above. You also need a special ring to talk to the fair lady, so it seems likely that they had their own language in Izalith as well. Out on this lava field, there's a way up to the second level of one of the structures here. You only get a small amount of souls for it, but if you're a ranged character you can pull the bounding demons together. They're some of the only enemies in the game that can damage each other, which is kind of a concession to how hard they are to kill normally. Before the first major patch, these ones also respawned, which made it much worse than it is now. That said, even with some improvements here, it's still not really worth killing them all, so I'm not even going to bother. Since this lava field is so wide, the player might not realise that there's a way upwards from here because there's a lot of surface area to explore. That's why across from this secret bonfire there's some debris which draws your attention. In all likelihood you'll probably think that there's an item hidden inside, so you head over that way and end up finding the way that you're supposed to go. It's a nice way of leading the player in the right direction by just trusting the fact that the player is going to want to explore things that stick out a little bit in the environment. Inside the first area of Izalith proper, there's not that much to talk about. The enemies here are just some slow-moving demonic statues that look quite similar to the Asylum demons. Since they float, they don't make any noise until they attack, so they can sneak up on you, but apart from that they're not very interesting. There's also a couple of enemy NPCs here as well, Daughter of Chaos and the final invasion by Kirk. Quilana seems to think that she's the only one who made it out of the catastrophe completely unscathed. If that's true, then the Daughter of Chaos here is probably demonic in some way under her robes. It fits because she's basically protecting the Bed of Chaos and she uses Chaos Pyromancy, so I think there's a good chance she's been transformed in some way too, we just don't get to see it. It's kind of disturbing to think about what she might look like. She drops the Izalith Catalyst, which is massive, and you can see them using it in the intro video. This mentions that fire wasn't always a separate school of magic. This is of course an important piece of history. The disaster that happened here is responsible for creating pyromancy, but I wonder if this is also meant as a subtle nod towards Demon Souls, since the mechanics behind fire magic is a bit different this time. After killing Kirk, his corpse can be found in the Fair Lady's chamber, which is another example of Dark Souls doing grey area as well. He's been invading you since the depths, and his thorny armour looks quite evil, but in reality he was just attempting to get humanity for her. This might even be the same covenant the player is in, so I'm sure for some people there's some very mixed feelings when they discover Kirk's corpse. The other enemies here are much more interesting visually, but also still pretty easy to kill. I remember being hung up on how disgusting these things look, but after playing Bloodborne they look downright cartoony in comparison. These guys highlight a fairly obscure mechanic which seems to be new in Dark Souls. Basically, during grab attacks, if you hammer the buttons you can mitigate some of the damage that would normally be done to you. In most cases it ends up looking a bit strange though, since the full grab animation continues to play out anyway. So it can look like your character should be taking a lot of damage when they aren't, particularly if you do this with the mimic grab. With these Chaos Eaters it's a bit different. There's actually a special animation of your character climbing out from inside them if you do it. Mechanically it's not very special, you're just rewarded for pressing buttons as fast as you can, but I think there's something to be said for the way it makes you feel that little bit closer to your character. This area is where we get to see the downfall of Solaire. I suppose since he's so likeable and seems more capable than most NPCs that I expected a bigger, better ending for him, but that was likely the entire point of this moment. His death is just as anticlimactic and pointless as the others. Despite what it might seem like from this video, I don't normally read item descriptions myself, but I took a moment to inspect Solaire's armor after killing him, which made it a double gut punch. For whatever reason, reading that Solaire's armor had no special properties was probably the most affecting moment I had on my first playthrough. In a time when so many games rely on ham-fisted dialogue, cutscenes and barely interactive set pieces, the way these games execute their stories is really praiseworthy. That said, as much as I enjoyed it at the time, on further reflection it didn't really make all that much sense, which cheapens it a little bit. The description on Solaire's shield, for example, says, "Decorated with a holy symbol, but Solaire illustrated it himself, and it has no divine powers of its own." The problem here is that the player character would have no way of knowing that Solaire drew the emblem himself. The only person that would know that is Solaire. This is something that Demon's Souls set up better because it was implied at the start that the player character was an adventurer of some sort. The character was willingly setting out into Boletaria despite the danger and may have even come from there in the first place. I think that goes a long way towards explaining why they might have some familiarity with the stuff they come across. In Dark Souls, despite all their similarities, the situation for the character is very different. Your character just sort of arrives in Lordran through happenstance, and there's no reason to think that they would know much about the area. You can understand how they might know about Big Hat Logan and the Ancient Lords, but Solaire is comparatively a nobody. The whole reason his story connects with people is because he's this weird, likeable character who's just trying to help people and make his way through the world. This just isn't the kind of information that the player character would have access to, and I think as the player, I probably shouldn't have access to that information either. This whole area has had some pretty poor bosses, so what better way to close it out than the worst boss of them all? Bed of Chaos gets a point from me for at least trying something different, bringing its total score to 1 point. Sometimes in games development an idea just doesn't work out, but nonetheless it survives into the final product anyway. In this case, no boss at all probably would have been better than what we got. I don't normally advocate any sort of cheating, but if you like you can quit out of the game after each phase of this boss to make it easier. Once you load back up you'll be teleported back to the start of this area, but any damage you've done to the boss will remain. You might not make the connection, but this is almost certainly the Witch of Izalith from the opening introduction. She attempted to duplicate the first flame and it didn't go so well. You might technically say she didn't fail though, as she did create new forms of life, they just happened to be demons. It's not entirely clear whether she's the malevolent spirit that comes out of the tree branches or the bug that you have to kill afterwards. Since she was trying to duplicate the first flame, she might even be both of them. Alternatively, she might be neither of them. This is Dark Souls after all, you can't really say that much for sure. Whatever the case, there are many references, both direct and indirect, to the Bed of Chaos in item descriptions and dialogue. Ultimately, that may be the reason why such a bad boss managed to slip into the final release. It was probably too tied into the lore to be removed at the last minute. The most interesting thing to me about this is the way the bug at the end quite strongly resembles the sunlight maggots. The name of the sunlight maggots also implies that they have some way to grow, so this could be what they grow into. We see so many sunlight maggots and only one which is a potentially mature version of them. It could be a very literal way of showing what happened to the daughters of Chaos, the fact that they're the children and she is the mother. But I suppose there's probably a million other ways you can interpret this as well. Are you still awake? I wouldn't blame you if you've drifted off. I know not many people are fond of Lost Izalith, and I do have a very soothing voice, but you should know that we're finished with it now. Thankfully, we're going to be moving on now to the much more interesting Artorias of the Abyss expansion stuff. There's several requirements to getting into this, and first of all, you have to rescue Dusk. Of course, Dusk herself has always been there, and on my first playthrough I rescued her as usual. Unfortunately, for whatever reason, when I went to summon her one time I hadn't killed all the golems in the area. I suppose I didn't realise how easily they become hostile. This was the end result.
I am Dusk of Ulasil. It is an honor to see you.
I remember being pretty annoyed at the time, but I don't use magic and Dusk wasn't quite as important back then, so I suppose in retrospect it wasn't a big deal. It's just a little embarrassing watching one of your NPCs be punched out of existence against your own will. With her rescued and a pendant from the Duke's archives, we can access the new area. I've talked a little in the past about how the challenge of these games can be raised and lowered at will. Since I enjoy the bosses of Ulasil, I've decided to challenge myself a bit more than usual and show these boss fights at their best. I'm just going to be using my broadsword against them, no Estus and no shield. Well, I will have the shield equipped, but if anything it's a handicap since I won't actually be using it. The Sanctuary Guardian is up first, and it's not an easily classified enemy. It's not Flora, not a humanoid, not a dragon, and not a demon. I get the impression from its design and its name it was most likely made by the residents of Ulasil using magic. Visually it's based on the mythical Manticore, but it's not entirely clear where it fits into the world of Dark Souls. That said, it is a perfect fit for this game because it looks very noble despite obviously being very scary as well, which is exactly the kind of enemy types that Dark Souls needs. It's a shame this boss kind of gets overshadowed by the other ones here because it's a really fantastic fight which manages to be very challenging without relying on any tired old moves. In particular, the move where it flies through the air and shoots electricity is very unique. Even the projectiles themselves are quite novel in the way they affect the water underneath them, meaning the player still needs to keep moving even after they've landed. This is also probably one of the best uses of tail attacks. It doesn't have many unique tail moves, and they're unlikely to kill the player themselves, but they do have a toxin element which strongly discourages you from staying behind it for too long. It's not easy to get behind it in the first place, but even if you can, you have to be very careful. The step up in difficulty here is noticeable even without the handicaps that I just placed on myself. As with every boss, the ones in the expansion all have movesets with strengths and weaknesses, but the AI that controls them seems to be holding back less than before. With the other bosses, you can feel that they're hesitating to kill you or not even really paying attention to what you're doing. All of the bosses here are that much more aggressive and more intelligent, which of course makes for a more intense fight. I like the attack animations on this boss as well, particularly the 2 and 4 hit combo that it has. The different length combos are quite similar, but there is a way you can tell them apart. If the first 2 attacks are both swipes or both headbutts, then he'll stop after 2 hits. Conversely, if the first 2 attacks are a swipe and a headbutt, then he'll continue to do the entire 4 hit combo. If you react fast enough, you can tell the 2 combos apart and either stay safe or punish this boss accordingly. The attack animations are equally great on the other bosses here. Very aggressive movesets which hit hard but have some clear opportunities for the player to strike back. That said, there is a case to be made that these bosses don't necessarily represent the best parts of these games. As I've said before, I strongly think that the true strength of these games is an experience which is greater than the sum of its parts. When it comes to the combat and the boss fights, by action RPG standards the mechanics are very enjoyable, but they lack depth. The weapons are the perfect example of what I'm talking about. Each weapon by itself only has a few moves, but finding them, improving them and customizing them adds a good bit to the experience. What it means is, when you're playing moment to moment, there isn't that much depth to your moveset, but you have many other choices outside of that which help to pull you into the experience. There are other games which are totally focused on combat, which naturally will have more interesting moment to moment gameplay mechanics and better bosses than these games. Learning and exploiting attack patterns can be very satisfying, but it definitely takes me out of the experience. Especially since it's not uncommon to die a couple of times while learning all of the boss's moves. That's why my favourite bosses in these games tend to be the ones which focus on the experience as much or more than the actual fight itself. I'm talking about the likes of Maiden Estrella, Storm King, Old Monk, Sif, Artorias and Gwyn. Those fights all caught me off guard in some way, making me simultaneously think about other things as I tried to survive. It's the kind of thing these games excel at compared to others, and I would like to see them play to that strength more often. Basically, I think the best bosses for these games are the ones that linger in your memory long after you've finished. As much as I really like fighting against this boss, it's not something that I remember afterwards because there's no story behind it, it's just a beast that you end up fighting. There are lots of other games where I can go and fight monsters like this, but it's only these games which can pull me in a way those games can't when it comes to the experience. After this boss, we have the Sanctuary itself, which is where we meet Elizabeth. There's little to no concrete information about her, but since she seems so concerned for Dusk, I like to imagine she was created as some kind of caregiver. Dusk is a princess after all, so it wouldn't be strange to think that she was raised by someone other than her mother. Although it is a little bit strange to think she was raised by something with no arms. It's clever that Elizabeth sells the same things Dusk sells, since Dusk's soap sign is temporarily out of service. The cast light spell is particularly useful. If someone got stuck in this area and wanted to try Tomb of the Giants, then they might need to have access to this spell, so it's good that they can still buy this from Elizabeth. In the Royal Wood, we have my favourite example of environmental storytelling in Dark Souls. It's really smooth how they reveal the backstory for the plant creatures just by their visual design. Nobody ever comments on it or tells you what they do, you just see it and implicitly understand that they were brought to life as gardeners by the residents of Oolacile. This is where the time travel element becomes abundantly clear. Now, it is my humble opinion that this game actually has better time travel than many other more story-heavy games. The events of Dark Souls are a closed time loop. When you travel between the past and the future, nothing changes in the future as the events of the past have already occurred. This is called the self-consistency conjecture, a theory which states that events in the past and future will always be consistent with each other even if there is such a thing as time travel. In other words, if you go back in time to try to cause a time paradox, then something will prevent you from doing it because those events have already been determined. Unless you want to get deep into multiverse theory, then this seems like the most satisfying way to handle time travel from a narrative perspective. It's often the case that time travel stories rewrite history, causing previously established events to become irrelevant. In most cases, I just don't think that overwriting things that have already happened makes for satisfying storytelling. They do cheat a little though with the Sif cutscene, which depends on whether you rescue him in the past. Really, the new cutscene that they added, if you rescue him in the past, should always be triggered because even if you kill him in the future, you can still rescue him in the past afterwards anyway. As it is now, you can kill Sif in the future and then rescue him in the past, and he doesn't recognize you in the future. It's not exactly a time paradox or anything, but it is a little bit of an inconsistency. That said, you can only really notice this inconsistency if you do multiple playthroughs, because with the basic cutscene there's not really any way of telling whether or not Sif recognizes you just based on that alone. We only know that he doesn't recognize you in that cutscene because he does recognize you in the other cutscene. Anyway, all in all, I think the time travel here is really solid. You get to learn more about the world without destroying the timeline which already existed. It seems like the best case scenario. This isn't necessarily intentional, it could just be because it was DLC, they didn't have time to do any fancy time travel shenanigans, but if you ask me, it works in the game's favour. Along with some good boss fights, this area also has a noticeable improvement in the sound design. In the background here, you can occasionally hear Dusk screaming and Sif howling, alongside more generic noises like chirping birds and running water. Later on, you can hear a breathing noise before Artorias, and the bloathead enemies in Ulysseal Township also make various roaring noises while they're standing around. It's not much really, but it's noticeably more than many of the other locations. There are some other instances of good environmental sound effects in the rest of the game, but they were perhaps too subtle for their own good. In the painted world, near all the pikes, there's a sort of whispery chanting effect in the background, but you can only hear it if you have the volume up and listen carefully. I think maybe the reason there's not a more diverse soundscape in other areas is because of memory limitations. Sound takes up a surprisingly large amount of storage, and with the seamless nature of the world, they may have had to conserve memory for more important things. That's just a guess though, and it might be completely off base. There's plenty of reason to suspect that the team were already thinking about or working on Bloodborne in some capacity at this point, so the more noticeable sound effects might just be a side effect of that. Also similar to Bloodborne, there's at least one patrolling sentry golem here, which makes the area that little bit more dangerous. There have been some patrolling enemies before this, mainly in the Tower of Latria and Painted World, but the path those enemies could take were so small that they didn't make much difference. Here, the sentry golem can catch you off guard since the area is so open and you're probably not expecting an enemy to be roaming around. Apparently, Miyazaki initially wanted the Black Knights to patrol large areas and make each playthrough feel that little bit different, but they weren't able to accomplish this. I get the feeling this might also come back to memory or at least performance concerns. It's possible they had to tightly control how many enemies a player could fight in each area in order to avoid performance drops. This area obviously reuses a lot of geometry from Darkroot Garden since it's the same area in the past. I can't really blame them for this though, since the best way of reinforcing the time travel aspect is showing the player an area they're familiar with in another time frame. It's just one of those catch-22 situations. It looks kind of lazy to reuse an area like this, but I know as a player, if we went time travelling and I didn't get to see at least one area I had already seen in a different time frame, I'd probably be pretty annoyed by that. The whole novelty of time travel is getting to see familiar things in a different way, so of course they would want to reuse at least one area from the base game. Even irrespective of the time travel, you can tell they made some effort to change it up so it wouldn't feel too stale. You go through it backwards, starting where the grave of Artorias will eventually be, and of course the time of day has changed to daytime, giving it a different appearance. This goes a fair way towards making the area feel less like a retread, and the further in you go, the more it changes from what you already know. I think this area lends a tiny bit more credibility to my theory about the sun from earlier on. In the past, this is called the Royal Wood, but in the future it's called Darkroot Garden, possibly because it's always dark there. This just makes it seem more like they were aware it was weird for it to be nighttime only in Darkroot Garden. Crossing this bridge, we run into Kalameet, which, just like the Drake encounter earlier, is done without a cutscene. This is obviously just something they like doing, so I imagine they just repeated it because they could, but it's also a little bit of a contrast from the one earlier. The Drake at the start lands with its back turned to you and doesn't acknowledge you, whereas Kalameet looks in your direction. This makes Kalameet appear more intelligent and thus more intimidating than the Drake. I get the impression that, even though they don't say anything, dragons were at least as intelligent as humans, if not more so. Kalameet does what looks like a psychic attack on the player, and Seath learned the most advanced magics of anyone. It's common for dragons in fiction to appear intelligent, and Dark Souls is no exception. I like that they accomplished this without resorting to dialogue though. It would probably just feel cheesy coming from a dragon. Further in we have Marvelous Chester, who I think is one of the most interesting NPCs. His clothes are all described as being exquisitely sewn. As I said earlier, some of the item descriptions seem like they're written by an omniscient narrator, but this one feels as though it's from the character's perspective. With their limited knowledge, they would have no way of knowing that Chester's clothes might be made with more modern manufacturing techniques. His little carrier bag is quite a bit more contemporary than most things, and his crossbow is also rather advanced, so this suggests to me that he's from a future beyond the one the player comes from. Even though Chester wasn't added until about a year later, he actually appears in the concept art book that came with the special edition of the initial release. Fat officials are also in the art book, but probably couldn't appear because they're from Demon Souls. I think this goes to show that someone on the development team has been wanting to do something like Bloodborne for quite a while. By the time they had a chance to include Chester, they probably knew what their next project would be, so I'm sure they put him in here as a sort of teaser as well. The next boss is Knight Artorias, probably my favourite boss battle in Dark Souls. I don't think there's any better way to fight him than Knight versus Knight, so I'm not going to talk over this one, I'm just going to let it play out. Enjoy. Can you feel my pain? Well, I suppose this gives me an opportunity to talk about it while I show my second attempt. This is just an overall solid fight, but one thing I really like is how Artorias' animations mimic Sif's animations. The two of them fight in a very similar style, or at least as similar as can be given their different body types. Of course, given the timeline, it's actually Sif who is copying Artorias. Ultimately, this makes both of them that little bit more endearing, as you can imagine Sif learning how to fight by watching Artorias in battle. Again, this is an example of storytelling done without relying on cutscenes or dialogue to get the point across. Some players might not notice it, but that's okay because there's always more to discover. I suppose my point is, rather than trying to force you to be interested in the world, these games trust that if you're playing, you're already interested, and go from there. As a result, they end up being much more engaging anyway. Chester mentions Artorias just beforehand and says he's a colourless sort, which didn't really give me the impression he's turned into a mindless monster like he has. Even so, I figured if Artorias would be a boss, he'd be at the end of the expansion, not here, so I found it a bit shocking when he appeared here. I think this is another great example of what sets the atmosphere of Dark Souls apart from the other games. Seeing Artorias for the first time is more sad than horrifying or disturbing. It's just disappointing seeing a once great hero reduced to this sorry state. He was corrupted by the Abyss after joining a covenant with them to attempt to destroy them from the inside out. This is reminiscent of the Nietzsche quote from Beyond Good and Evil, which says, "He who fights monsters might take care lest he thereby become a monster. And when you gaze long into an abyss, the abyss also gazes into you." Nietzsche just meant this in a philosophical sense, of course, but I suppose it could indicate that there's a psychological element to the Abyss in Dark Souls which drives people mad. Either that, or it's just another thing taken from Berserk. One thing that might have helped me survive the first fight with Artorias is upgraded armor, so I finally bothered to go and do that after this battle. I can't say that this is an addition I'm particularly fond of myself, but it does have its upsides. It does encourage you to pick a set of armor and stick with it for better or worse. Seeing your character consistently in the same clothes gives them a stronger sense of identity, I think. It also ostensibly gives you a decision between offense and defense, but really this is a false dichotomy. Overall, the benefits between weapons and armor might even be equal, but weapon upgrades only require a quarter of the materials, which makes the choice a no-brainer. As with most things in Dark Souls, armor upgrades are optional, which is good, but it loosens the balance, particularly when it comes to bosses. Now, on top of several different weight classes, there's also several varying levels of upgrades within those classes as well. Since players don't even need to upgrade armor to get through the game, it really just means that upgrading armor is just another way to make the game that little bit easier for yourself. Oolacile Township is of course where the residents of Oolacile used to live, but now they're all bloatheads. You should keep in mind though that they were never human to begin with, and neither is Dusk. Elizabeth mentions how human your scent is, but if Dusk were human as well, Elizabeth probably wouldn't have a reason to comment on it. It's never made entirely clear what the difference is between human-sized people like this and actual humans, but apparently there is one. I'm guessing what sets them apart is that humans have a portion of the Dark Soul. As if Chester wasn't already reminiscent enough of Bloodborne, he uses a sidestep instead of a roll. Gwyn's Knights and a lot of bosses do this as well, but as far as I'm aware, he's the only NPC which has this move. Of course, I can't say for sure that they did this intentionally as some kind of foreshadowing of Bloodborne, but it really seems that way to me. I'm not attacking him much here because I'm trying to get as much footage of the sidestep as I can, and I think he gets bored because he decides to head back to the big dream in the sky. Oolacile Township is quite linear, but it can be a refreshing change of pace in the second half, since the other areas after Anor Londo tend to have some pretty extreme gimmicks to them. There's not much to explore, but what extra areas there are loop back around smoothly like the best areas of Undead Burg or Painted World. There's a nice area off to the side here where we can find the silver pendant, which I suppose counts as the gimmick for this area. It's useful for the fight with Manus, and it's just an all-around interesting item. To me, this highlights the problem with the quick slots though. Since Estus and items are mapped to the same button, you need to swap between them, which would be alright if not for the way new consumables get placed in a rotation automatically, which is a pain. Even though I just want to have the pendant and Estus equipped, anything else I pick up is going to be slotted in there as well, which means I'll have to cycle through extra stuff that I don't want. You would think that they would have an option to toggle this, since it was also an issue in Demon's Souls. The pendant here raises a lot of questions, particularly the fact that it's hidden behind an illusory wall. We can't say whether or not Artorias hid it here himself. From the sounds of it, he was presented this by Gwyn himself, so I doubt he'd part with it lightly. I get the impression Artorias volunteered for the job, since everyone seems to think he was a noble man. He may have hid it here himself so he could join a covenant with the Abyss, or it could be the case that it was stolen, or even that he accidentally lost it. Ulasil sorcerers would be able to make a hidden wall that you open with light like this, so I do think it's possible that somebody other than him placed it here. These are, I think, the only other opened chests apart from the one in Firelink Shrine. The opened chest in Firelink has a special purpose though. If you drop a critical item, it'll reappear inside that chest, allowing you to finish your playthrough. I don't know why they didn't just block you from dropping critical items in the first place, but at least it shows that chest has a reason to exist. These ones, on the other hand, just sit here as decoration. Now, it makes sense to me that not every chest should be closed and have an item inside, but I think it sticks out since these are the only ones like this. There is an empty chest after Gwendolyn as well, but at least that one is closed. If I still thought there were secrets to be discovered, these chests would be somewhere I would concentrate on because of how strange it is in the grand scheme of things. I can see why they wanted to use these as decoration, just as a little bit of realism, but without other chests scattered around the game that are similar, these ones stick out more than anything else. They probably accomplished the opposite of what they set out to do here because they look so conspicuous. Another item found nearby is the I'm Sorry carving dropped by one of the Bloathead sorceresses. This is the last of these non-hostile enemies that we'll be seeing. The casters of Ulasil were likely involved in the disaster here, so this one is probably holding the carving because she regrets what she's done. I think this harkens back to what I was talking about a few minutes ago about the strength of these games being the experience itself. In terms of gameplay, there's nothing interesting about an enemy which doesn't fight back, but as long as it's only done every once in a while, as an experience it's significantly more interesting than fighting basic enemies. You're given a glimpse into the sorrow of this situation and reminded that these were once people, not unlike your own character. It's a boring battle of course, but it's worth the trade-off because of how much it enhances the overall tone of the game. Once you make it inside this building, the bloatheads start to have glowing eyes, which indicates that they hit harder than the ones earlier. I didn't realise this myself, even though in retrospect it should have been pretty obvious. The UI of Dark Souls is not its strongest element. I think even from a visual perspective it just looks quite a bit worse than the one in Demon's Souls. The sketchy sort of look that it has doesn't really seem to suit the game world, but there is a nice side benefit of it with the health bars and stamina bars. The added measuring lines on it can be surprisingly useful. It can help you figure out when to use your Estus and give you a better idea of just how much stamina you might have left. If I had been paying attention, I would see when I got hit by an attack by these bloatheads that they do more damage than the other ones because more of the segments would be depleted. Regardless of whether you notice it or not, this will cause an increase in the difficulty as you push further into the area. In retrospect, I'm surprised that stuff like this doesn't happen more often, but I suppose for most of the game they had enough enemy types not to rely on this sort of trick. Normally they build the difficulty by rearranging enemies into different layouts, which is a more dynamic and interesting way to challenge the player. This area is where we find the crest key, which we can use to get to Go. This raises the question of why we even need a key to visit him in the first place. It seems like he's imprisoned, but also doesn't seem to bear any ill will towards anyone. He just says he's in retirement. He also says he's blind, but that may not be the case. The description on his helm says, "A helm crafted especially for the Honourable Hawkeye Go. Only the eye holes were packed with tree resin by those who dismissed Go as a brutish giant." I think it's possible he's locked here for his own good, to keep him safe from people who think of him as a brute. He could easily break himself out, so it seems like he's here willingly. To me, Go really highlights one of the nice things about the way Miyazaki crafts these worlds and characters. The stories and character arcs are so bleak that when you come across someone who is genuinely benevolent and likeable, it comes as a shock and is just more impactful. Before this stuff came out, I don't think anybody really expected Go to be the most likeable of Gwyn's elite knights, but he definitely is.
I suppose.
The last of those knights is Kieran, whom we only get to meet once. She gives up her weapons in exchange for Artorias' soul, which I think indicates that she's going to give up being a Lord's Blade and retire like Go. She probably regrets not retiring earlier now that Artorias is dead. When attacked, it shows that she has an issue with humans, which also means she isn't human even though her size might make her seem so. Since she's found at a makeshift grave, she obviously has a lot of respect for Artorias. I think there's also a bit of a romantic undertone there as well, but given their size difference, I'm not really sure how that's supposed to work out. This raises the question of why she didn't help Artorias take on the Abyss though. Go is blind, or at least thinks he is, and we know from some of his dialogue that the dragons have already been taken care of. He says, "What good is a dog with no hares to hunt?" It's possible, as the leader, Ornstein was stuck doing some political or boring work as he's seen doing in the future. They also couldn't include him as an NPC in the expansion even if they wanted to, because it would open up potential for a time paradox if the player killed him. None of these issues apply to Kieran though, so it's not clear why she wasn't helping Artorias. I think the only viable explanation is that she had some sort of job to do at the time which kept her from helping until it was too late. I've scoured as hard as I can for more information on what she was doing, but as far as I can tell, we don't know of even a single assassination that takes place in the world of Dark Souls, despite the fact that Kieran is quite clearly an assassin. This probably just means she was good at her job though. If anything, it would be strange if we did know anything about her assassinations. Kieran is a name that sticks out to me because it's something that people are actually called here in Ireland, and it's a boy's name. So I looked it up, and apparently it means Little Dark One, which is quite a suitable name for her. There's a little bit more of Oolacile Township still to go. I think by far the most difficult part of this area is this: 2 sorceresses and 3 brawlers placed in a small area with a mini-boss right afterwards. This is strategically placed just after the player is given an opportunity to open the shortcut. Yet more proof that these games aren't for masochists, despite what some people might have you believe. The mini-boss after this is by far the strangest one, and the only one that isn't used more than once. I believe it's a chained prisoner, which means it probably comes from the short little prison area just right after this. I find it a bit strange that they would put so much work into this enemy when otherwise the expansion is kind of lacking for new enemies. There's just the bloatheads, the forest gardeners, the golems, and one more enemy type that we'll see now in a second. You would think that the time they spent making this enemy would be better put to use making an enemy that they could reuse, since this one would just be annoying to fight more than once. It's definitely interesting for what it is. Its attack animations are quite different and you do have to approach it very cautiously, but I just think that the effort would have been better spent elsewhere. The last enemy type here is found in the Chasm of the Abyss. Seeing the humanities for the first time is probably the most memorable experience I've had with these games so far. I'm not a fan of paid for DLC because I like my games to be a complete package, but I have to admit that this was actually enhanced by being part of the expansion. This stuff came out a year after the main game released, so players were very familiar with the concept of consuming humanity. The description on humanity refers to it as a sprite, so you can kind of get the impression it might be a living thing, but over time the act of using humanity seems harmless because it has no negative effects. After discovering this, it casts a shadow over everything humanity related in the game, and it's just a creepy moment even outside of that as well. The description on the Pursuer's spell implies that they attempt to touch you out of either envy or love, in case you didn't already feel bad enough killing them. They also make this odd sort of humming noise, which is initially a little bit disconcerting, but almost sounds sort of comforting once you get used to it. As much as I loved seeing these things for the first time, I have to admit that this is the kind of thing that should have been in the game when it released. In fact, the entire Artorias of the Abyss expansion seems so tightly tied into the game that it all should have been there on day one. Now, maybe not all of this was planned, and if it wasn't, then I think that's just a testament to how well they did with this content, but I'm sure at least some of this was planned much earlier on. Dark Souls is one of my favourite games, but it's definitely been a victim of deadlines and I would argue greedy publishing. Publishers don't really care about games in the same way players or developers do, so they don't really mind if the game gets cut up and sold as DLC. There's a mentality that things can always be finished later, and of course they'll make more money off it that way as well. Even without this extra stuff, Dark Souls is a pretty long game for what it is. I would certainly say it's value for money. It keeps you going for quite a while. That doesn't change the fact that this stuff should have been here when the game released though. It's great that we now get to experience this stuff, but the problem is it doesn't tie into the main game as well as it should. If you do the Artorias of the Abyss expansion early, then it'll be quite difficult, but the amount of souls and equipment that you'll get here will make the rest of the game much easier. Alternatively, if you do it towards the end, it doesn't throw the balancing out too much, but it does destroy the pacing. It doesn't really make much sense to go into the past, do a bunch of random stuff, and then go and fight Gwyn. The two aren't very connected to each other. If this stuff had been here when the game came out, they might have been able to solve these issues. For example, instead of splitting the game in two at Anor Londo, they might have been able to split it into 3 segments to balance this area better compared to the others. The only way to stop this, of course, is to demand better out of the games by not buying them until you're happy with them. I just think it's sad that since we all bought into this, myself included, then future games of this type are all going to have the same problem. They're all going to launch and then have extra areas and bosses added later on. No matter how well that stuff is going to be implemented, I just don't see it slotting in as well as the stuff that's in the base game, so I really wish that this wasn't the case. I also personally just really like buying a game on the first day and knowing that I'm getting a complete package out of it, something I can put on a shelf and come back and play years later. Almost like it's a work of art instead of just an excuse to nickel and dime people. So yeah, I would say I have some pretty conflicting feelings on this. This is one of the few DLCs that I've bought, and I certainly enjoyed my time with it, but I also don't like feeling like I'm part of the problem. I do think that deadlines are a necessary evil to focus the development team who would probably otherwise just take all the time in the world. But for a game with the scale of Dark Souls, the deadline was quite aggressive and the end product shows that. Just next to the humanities there's a drop-off here which I really like. The floor disappears as though it's an illusion and you end up dropping down quite far. I assume this is because Alvina is trying to lead you to Sif, but that's not really the interesting part. Mechanically, this is almost identical to the crumbling floors I complained about earlier. The player walks somewhere and has no way of knowing that the floor will give out underneath them. Unlike before though, this one protects you from the fall damage with some magical mist. I think it's an indication that the developers learned their lesson about the crumbling floors being unfair. It doesn't fix the problem in the base game, but it does show some improvement, which I'm quite happy to see. I'm sure, like most jobs, games development is an ongoing learning process. Nobody starts out perfect, but what they've shown here is a willingness to improve and learn from past missteps. It is just one instance, but there aren't any collapsing floors in Bloodborne either, at least not outside the Chalice dungeons, and even the ones I've encountered there weren't high enough to cause fall damage. My point is, I'm fairly confident they reversed their thinking on those kinds of traps around the time that they were putting this area together. It's here where we can rescue Sif, and if we do so, we can summon him for the boss fight coming up. The barrier surrounding him is created by Artorias' shield, which is why Artorias doesn't have a shield when you fight him. I'm not really sure why they put Sif behind an illusory wall here. Alvina tries to lead you towards it, but it can still be quite difficult to find just by yourself. Personally, I think they should have just placed the developer message in front of it, especially since they could have changed the picture on the developer messages. If they changed the picture on the developer notes to Artorias, then you would be following in his footsteps, which would be especially interesting since you've just killed him. There are some prism stones scattered around here which are just to ensure that the player can find their way since the area is quite dark, but I like to imagine that they were left by Artorias, and I think it would have been nice to have some confirmation of this. Another thing we can find here is a pyromancy called Black Flame. Its description says that a pyromancer was wandering Oolacile, which is a significant clue about the time frame we've ended up in. As I said earlier, Quilana mentions that her mother has suffered for about 1,000 years. The fall of Izalith was also the birth of pyromancy, so this spell here indicates that Izalith has already been ruined. This means we're less than 1,000 years in the past, which is a lot more recent than I would have guessed. Up next we have Manus, who is most likely the pygmy seen in the introduction since it's the only Lord Soul left unaccounted for. Gwyn and the others seem to fear Manus, and with good reason. It's a bit strange then that Oolacile seems to have been built right on top of where he was buried. It seems like his Lord Soul is the opposite of theirs, but there's nothing to say that they were always on bad terms. At the start he's described as the furtive pygmy, and being furtive just means being shy, wanting to go unnoticed or avoid confrontation. So from the sounds of this, Manus just wanted to be left alone, and maybe they didn't pay much attention to him. I also get the impression that this may have been where they found their Lord Souls in the first place. In the introduction video, the flame is found in some kind of cavern not dissimilar from this one. There's also some ancient crumbled pillars and grave markings around Manus which show that this place is much older even than Oolacile itself. Go seems to think that Manus was driven mad by the residents of Oolacile, probably when they took his pendant. He seems like a fairly reliable source of information, so I'd say that's exactly what happened. Manus is, of course, quite scary and monstrous, but he's also probably just as tragic as everything else in the game. Keep in mind he doesn't harm Dusk, and his soul is described as a lukewarm lump of gentle humanity. Afterwards, Dusk says she detected feelings of longing and nostalgia and wonders whether Manus really was a beast after all. If you think about it, you can see how, from the perspective of the gods and the people of Oolacile, the humans would come across as bad guys. They seem to just be slowly taking over the world like an unstoppable force which will bring about the Age of Dark. None of this is really Manus's fault though. Before they disturbed his body, it seems like he was just happy enough to be left alone. It's the same way with the player character. They can't really be blamed for what they are either. I suppose all the bosses in Oolacile are optional, but Kalameet is the most optional of them all. The Dragon King Greataxe describes the Gaping Dragon as a distant, deformed descendant of the Everlasting Dragons. Seath is obviously deformed too, so this makes Kalameet the only proper dragon fight in the entire game. The semi-forced death when you first encounter Kalameet might come across as grating, especially since they pull a similar trick with Seath, but mechanically it's almost identical to every other boss. Once you walk through some boss fog, you're locked in there anyway, which means your souls are locked in there too. Losing them in the boss arena once doesn't really change that. The only way you'll be punished for it is if you die on the way back to Kalameet, but the route towards him is intentionally quite easy. Since he takes a moment to fly back into the arena, you also have plenty of time to pick your souls back up and continue on as normal. To keep your souls safe, you need to beat the boss, but that's just as true anywhere else in the game too. I'm still not a big fan of being forced to die here anyway, but I can see why they thought the cutscene where Go shoots down Kalameet made it a worthwhile trade-off. You don't fight Kalameet at full strength, and it seems like it would have been impossible to take him on at full capacity. That isn't actually the case though. If you have a bow and the patience of a saint, you can take down Kalameet on your first encounter with him, Demon Souls style. Go even has some very slightly altered dialogue if you decide to do it that way. If you actually want to have fun though, you'll probably fight him properly, in which case he's already been massively damaged for you. This is a common theme with bosses in this game. Artorias has a broken arm and is corrupted by the Abyss, other bosses are fought long after their heyday. Setting it up that way means they get to preserve their legendary status even though they're ultimately killed by a loser like you. This certainly deserves some points for being the only proper dragon fight, but for me it has one big problem. There are essentially two different kinds of hitboxes when you're fighting an enemy. Those you can clip through using invincibility frames and those you can't. The body on most bosses would work that way. You don't want the player rolling right through the enemy, so they're only allowed to roll through certain parts, usually the weapon. This is especially noticeable on bigger bosses. You can roll through the tail of the bell gargoyles, but not the one of the gaping dragon, because that one is so large it would look strange for you to clip through it. My problem with Kalameet is that he has head swipe attacks which work the same way. Even though you might roll at the right time, you'll still collide with his head. The swipe will push you to one side, and by the time the attack is over, your invincibility frames will have worn off. You can see here, to avoid this I have to roll through his neck instead, which is what I'm doing. You can definitely work around it, but I find it frustrating when it happens nonetheless. It feels a little cheap. In the grand scheme of things, this is a pretty small issue though, and I certainly wouldn't complain about a few more bosses of this kind of quality. There is a good argument to be made that Kalameet is the most difficult boss in the game thanks to his aggressive attack animations and massive health pool. I particularly like the attack where he charges at you and then spins around and sprays his black flame everywhere. It's well animated, difficult to punish, and most importantly it's something you can imagine an intelligent dragon would actually do to protect itself. He also has one of the most interesting drops in the game by far, the Calamity Ring. All it does is double the amount of damage you take, so I'm guessing the idea is if you're looking for a challenge, you take it with you into New Game Plus and will then die much more quickly to the enemies. It's a bit of a lazy way of boosting the difficulty, but I wouldn't mind seeing more items like this which change the way the game is played a little. They wouldn't necessarily have to be beneficial or detrimental, just different. At the very least, it makes some sense to give players this ring now instead of some other reward, because if you've beaten Kalameet, there's no need for you to become any more powerful anyway. Overall, this is probably my least favourite of the bosses in Oolacile, but it's clear a lot of effort went into it regardless, and it's still one of the better bosses in the game. It seems like a lot of effort went into the bosses in particular in the extra content, which makes it a worthwhile addition for that much alone. Before we leave the past, there's one last major thing here, the Battle of Stoicism. We're going to do a best of 3 against each other to show this thing off. I have a lot to talk about here, so I'm not going to give you a play-by-play of what's happening, but I'll tell you the key things to look out for. The first thing you should keep in mind is that the Scythe is a fairly unique weapon in that its animations swing so widely they can actually hit the opponent from behind. That, as well as its good stat scaling, have made it into a very popular weapon, although my opponent mainly just uses it because it looks cool. Since I'm relying on a shield, the hitbox is a real danger for me and I don't handle it particularly well. You'll see I often try to get behind or away from her to stay safe, but it ends up backfiring. Really what I should be doing is standing right in front and tanking the hit to my shield. It'll do no damage to me that way anyway. The problem is, even though I'm quite a defensive character, I tend to play aggressively anyway, otherwise I get bored. It's really less than ideal, but what can I say, I like what I like. The few times where I really do go on the defensive tend to be because of the bleed effect that you'll see build up on me over time. Even if the scythe bounces off my shield, it still builds this up, and if it maxes out I'll suffer a huge amount of damage, so I can't let that happen. The bleed and stamina of our two characters is really where the strategy comes into this fight. Depending on how we think the other player is doing, we'll be more aggressive or defensive. Another thing you might notice if you're paying attention is the overly large hitbox on the Black Flame spell. That's the short range flame which bursts right in front of her hand. I'm guessing that some of the spell and weapon hitboxes are overly large because the game is primarily designed as a single player experience. You can imagine if the player ended up using an attack which looked like it should hit but ended up missing, then they'd become very frustrated. To avoid that problem, they would most likely skew the hitboxes a little bit in the player's favour. It's not a problem when you're just playing by yourself, but it can result in some unfortunate effects when playing online. Pyromancy like this is a relatively common aspect of online play because the Pyromancy Flame doesn't have stat requirements. It's upgraded separately from everything else. That means you can avail of pyromancy without having to build your character in a specific way. If you're really into the online portion of the game and some pyromancy might complement your character, then there's virtually no downside to having it. The best way to deal with pyromancy is usually to back off, but the way this duel is set up, that's not always an option. In here you have 3 minutes to kill your opponent more times than they kill you. If they have the lead, it's pretty easy to just run away for the rest of the match, but thankfully neither of us use such cheap tactics. My playstyle isn't quite as interesting as hers, but you'll see I have an extra option when using my spear. Spears can be used from behind a shield, allowing you to deal damage while also staying safe. It consumes a huge amount of stamina to do so, and the reach isn't as good as usual, but it's a valid tactic against aggressive players. It's for that reason that I find spears to be one of the more interesting weapon types, because they combine well with another existing mechanic. Usually weapons are just used for attacks and don't combine in any meaningful way with the dodging or blocking. With spears there's a little bit of overlap which makes them that little bit more tactical, even if they are ultimately very defensive and passive weapons. I like the odd competitive game myself, but I can't say I've ever been particularly interested in this aspect of these games. That said, I'm not against the idea of a Colosseum, considering it probably didn't take too much work and possibly provided a lot of value to some people. Obviously I enjoy the gameplay on offer here, but the mechanics don't have a particularly high skill ceiling. You can block, dodge and attack, so the essentials are there, but in terms of inputs it's pretty simplistic, and most attack animations are relatively lengthy compared to other games. Basically I don't think there's that much room for better players to distinguish themselves from worse players. Learning parry timings does provide a layer of skill to this, but lag can often make a parry impossible to land even if you know exactly what to do. Building your character might take a lot of forethought and planning, but it's the kind of thing others can easily copy anyway. I've also never been big on the kind of min-maxing that's required to be truly competitive at this kind of stuff. Getting staggered is a major disadvantage when fighting against another player, so this results in players wearing heavy armor for poise, but also boosting their equip load as much as possible for faster rolls. It ends up looking ridiculous and puts characters like that into a completely different tier than the ones most players will organically build over the course of the game. If you skew the stats and the equipment just right, it feels like there's no meaningful trade-offs being made. I just don't think that heavily armoured knights should be able to do backflips no matter what way they distribute their stats. I can appreciate the effort that goes into finding the perfect build for the kind of character you want to make, but I don't think that necessarily makes the online play satisfying from moment to moment. For me at least, the battle we're having here is more interesting than completely decked out characters. I would say ultimately her character is better than mine thanks to her gear, but she's nowhere near as optimised as she could be. Each character has extreme pros and cons. I'm heavy, don't maneuver well, but I can take a lot of punishment, don't stagger easily and can block a lot if I like. She moves much faster, has better opportunities to deal damage, but can't handle damage as well as I can. Basically she's higher risk, higher reward, and I'm playing something more safe. Whatever your thoughts on competitive play, I think one thing most of us can agree on is that lag is a severe problem for the online, probably the biggest issue of them all. This is first and foremost because play isn't done through servers, just the matchmaking. This is a common setup for a lot of games. There's a master server that lists available players and is responsible for pairing them up. Once that's done, it's a peer-to-peer connection. Ideally, the game would use a server for all online interactions, as the server acts as an impartial observer. It basically runs its own simulation of the events to check whether the player's movements and actions are allowed. In other words, it verifies that what the players are doing is actually possible within the limits of the game world. Thankfully, it doesn't have to render the entire game to make that happen. It mostly just validates the positions and movements of the players, but nonetheless it has to be maintained by the developers, which costs money. By comparison, peer-to-peer matchmaking costs virtually nothing. The downside is, without that impartial observer, clients can just lie to each other about what they're doing. Peer-to-peer is more vulnerable to hacking because there's no server to validate the information sent between clients. Not only that, it doesn't deal as well when one player lags. I mentioned earlier that hard drives are relatively slow, but internet connections are even slower and much less reliable. If a game is running at 30 frames a second, it updates the screen every 33 milliseconds, but new information might only arrive from the enemy player every 100 milliseconds or more. This means the game has to perform lag compensation to fill in the gaps. While it's waiting for the latest information from the enemy player, your machine will take the last known movements of the enemy and continue to apply them as a guess of where the enemy will move next. In other words, if the enemy is moving left and we haven't heard from them yet, we just assume that they're still moving left. If this guess turns out to be wrong, then once an update is received from the other player, they might snap into a new position. You see this a lot in these games because players are often in close quarters combat, poking and prodding at each other, which means a lot of back and forth movements. You might move forward just for half a second and then pull back, but if the connection lags after you move forward, then you'll continue to move forward from your enemy's perspective. If the enemy then backstabs you, it seems valid because from their point of view it looked like that's what you were doing. This is why your backstabs always look fine, whereas getting backstabbed sometimes means the enemy instantly teleports behind you. One way this can be exploited is with a lag switch, a device which temporarily blocks the traffic between the two players. If you're standing still and I press the lag switch, then I can just walk up behind your character and backstab you because you're not moving on my screen. When I turn off the lag switch, my game will tell your game that I backstabbed you and then you'll die. And yes, that is something that players have made to exploit certain games. It actually works, at least to some degree anyway. We're just wrapping this up now, and I wish we had a more exciting finale for you, but in the final round I stumble quite a lot and just end up flat out losing. Believe me, I did consider using a different set of duels to make this last match a bit more interesting and give myself a second chance, but that would clearly be dishonest. Sometimes a match just goes one way or another, and I suppose I should at least be happy I managed to take one round. Also, I won the duel earlier in the Painted World, so really we're even. Since the Artorias of the Abyss stuff is pretty action-packed, I think it would be nice to visit somewhere more relaxing next. Unless you have a fear of heights, in which case you might want to close your eyes for this one. The way the Great Hollow is hidden is one of the cheapest tricks they've done so far. After going through one illusory wall, you then have to find another one hidden behind a chest. I didn't find this on my first playthrough, and I can't imagine many others did. As much as I wish the way they hid it was a little more interesting, I do love how well hidden it is. This kind of thing is especially rare in modern games because of how much work they take to make. Developers are afraid to put so much effort into something if the player isn't going to see it. It's a pretty reasonable concern for them, all things considered, but I love that Dark Souls stands in contrast to this trend. The Return to the Undead Asylum, the Painted World, Great Hollow and Ash Lake are all pretty well hidden areas. When you think about it, that's a considerable amount of effort spent on things the player may never find. It's a sad reality that for any given game, the majority of players are unlikely to play it all the way to the end, so I think hiding content well like this might be less irrational than it first appears. A player is either enjoying a game or they aren't, and it seems like a better choice to me to tailor the experience towards those who are into it more than those who still need convincing. If the lukewarm players aren't going to play all the way to the end, you have to question whether it really matters if a few things are hidden from them. On the flip side, the ones who are really into the game will feel rewarded when they realise there was something significant they missed out on the first time. It means that for them, the game now has more content than they originally thought it had, at least that's how I felt anyway. Nowadays, this kind of hidden content can easily be found by anyone through the internet, which I think makes a less risky inclusion than it was in the past. It's now very easy for players to discover everything if they really want to, no matter how well hidden it is. Lots of other games could hide substantial secrets like this, but I think it works particularly well in Dark Souls because the note system acts as a middle ground. If you see a note on the ground leading you to the second invisible wall, there's probably going to be a moment of doubt or hesitation about what you're reading. Notes are never an official source of information, so it's a lot more like talking to a friend or discovering something through hearsay. You don't know whether to believe it, and because of that, it still manages to maintain some of its surprise. There are some valuable items here. Even right at the start, you can find the Chloranthy ring, one of the better rings I think, although if you're willing to wear the crest shield you don't need it. This is a nice example of internal consistency since the ring itself looks similar to the green blossoms, which are the consumable items that boost stamina. The grass crest shield also has a sort of plant on the front of it, which may be what the green blossoms are supposed to grow from. The design on the grass crest shield actually comes from a contest which was held before the release of Dark Souls where people submitted their own shield designs. It could be that the team already wanted a stamina regenerating shield and then this design came along which was a nice fit, and perhaps that's the reason why it was selected. Whatever the case, it takes effort and coordination from the art team to think about these things, and the end result is a nice little sense of history. Much like how people in reality will associate certain plants with certain effects, this occurs in Dark Souls as well. It's a very minor detail, but that's how good world building is done. Lots of little details that work together in unison. This area has a bunch of crystal lizards and 2 of each type of titanite chunk. Since the Great Hollow is optional, this was smart of them because it makes this area a worthwhile visit for any character. I actually think this is one of the best balanced areas in the entire game as a result. Not necessarily the most challenging, far from it, but just well balanced. Since the challenge primarily comes from navigating the environment safely, it affects all character types equally. Every character should have a similar amount of difficulty here, and thanks to the variety of titanite chunks, every character also has a similar amount to gain. The Great Hollow also exemplifies the vertical nature of Dark Souls in general, which is really impressive. It's true that they often use elevators as shortcuts, but you also can't ignore all the staircases, ladders and slopes which get you from point A to point B in the first place. And of course, all of that is especially impressive given the interconnectivity of most of the world. I think this is one of those points that's really hard to get across, but there's a reason why people, myself included, harp on about the verticality of this game. If you ever try to open up a level editor yourself and make something, you might be surprised how tempting it is to just sprawl outwards horizontally. Even then, overcoming that compulsion is really just the first step. You also need to craft the environment in a way which adequately guides the player, leads to interesting enemy encounters, accommodates any special events that need to occur there, and also looks like an area that might reasonably exist. Dark Souls manages to do all of that, while also imbuing the level design with a certain aesthetic charm you don't see very often. It's especially impressive here, since you can enter the Great Hollow before getting the Lord Vessel, which means it has to be traversable both ways. Since you sometimes have to drop from one branch to another to move down, it's confusing and a little surprising that you can also make your way upwards. I know it might sound like a hassle, but if you've only ever gone down the Great Hollow, I think you should try going up it as well. There's not much point in doing so if you can warp, but it really shows the strength of the level design here. I also like the choice of enemies here. Since these areas are so well hidden, they didn't receive priority when it came to making new enemies, which is understandable. Despite that, the ones that appear here all make sense anyway. They're all fauna of some sort, which makes it believable that they would appear in several different locations. This is the worst possible place that crystal lizards could be, so of course up to 10 of them can appear here. I'm sure they killed a lot of greedy players here, which is exactly what they wanted. There's a subtle change to the mechanics behind crystal lizards in Dark Souls. This time around they'll respawn as many times as needed until the player kills them. In Demon Souls, you had a limited number of chances to kill a crystal lizard before it disappeared for the rest of the playthrough. As far as I can see, the respawn system for the lizards in Demon Souls was superior, and I think it's pretty easy to justify why. First of all, you just need to think about what crystal lizards accomplish. They're not designed to test the player's combat prowess, since they just run away without fighting back. What they do is test your situational awareness, or apply a sudden shock to you in order to see how well you'll respond. So if the point of crystal lizards is to put the player under pressure, then really they should be designed in a way which maximizes the amount of pressure the player feels. Demon Souls does that with limited respawns, whereas Dark Souls doesn't. This isn't a tragedy by any means, it's a very small change, and most people who played Demon Souls first will probably assume that the lizards work the same way anyway, but to me it feels like a concession that Dark Souls didn't need to make. The resources from crystal lizards are purely a bonus, you don't need them to beat the game, so I see no issue with players being deprived of them permanently. Basilisks are also a well-chosen enemy for this place, as Curse results in a permanent health reduction, which makes the drops a lot more dangerous. It's not entirely cruel though, because if you press on and make it to the end, there's a good chance you can get a Purging Stone from one of the clams in Ash Lake. It doesn't seem like a coincidence that this area is called the Great Hollow, given how important hollowing is to the story. It makes me wonder if perhaps the reason the world of Dark Souls is in so much trouble is because this tree is hollow. As we emerge into Ash Lake, we can see lots of other trees, but we don't know whether they're the same on the inside as the Great Hollow. I like to imagine that they're healthier, but I can't say for sure. If you managed to save Siegmeyer earlier, this is the end of his storyline, and it turns out he has kind of a complicated backstory. For some reason, when he was back in Katarina, his daughter killed him, but neither of them seem to dislike each other because of it. She comes to Lordran to pass on the last words of her mother, which presumably causes Siegmeyer to hollow, after which she kills him again. This is another good example of events happening in Dark Souls without the presence of the player. Nobody informs you where the two of these are going next or what's happened between them, you just find them after Siegmeyer's already been killed. In my opinion, this very effectively reinforces Siegmeyer and Sieglind as their own characters, maybe more than any other way they could have presented this scene. I think the conventional wisdom would say that for the player to care about something that's happened, they need to feel involved in it in some way, but for me at least, this scene shows that that's not necessarily true. Shoehorning the player into their pivotal moment probably would have just cheapened it. In a lot of other games, it's hard not to feel sometimes like the entire world is scripted solely around you, because of course it is. But something simple like this can really help to alleviate that feeling. This particular sub-story was never really about you, so its conclusion doesn't need to include you either. I like this moment, but I do wonder if it would have been done differently had they more time and resources. NPCs in Dark Souls simply don't interact with each other at all. I'm guessing the team probably felt they couldn't make it look convincing or had some other sort of trouble with it and crafted the game with this limitation in mind. It may just be that Siegmeyer's storyline ends the way it does because they couldn't execute some more elaborate plans for it. While it might have been interesting to see some more NPC interactions, I think overall it works in the game's favour. It wouldn't suit every game, but it's a good fit for Dark Souls considering the isolated feeling they were going for. I didn't bother mentioning the Hydra in Darkroot earlier on because it's kind of a boring enemy. It's very intimidating seeing it in the distance for the first time, but ultimately it's a rather simple mini-boss which is more of a hassle than anything else. I like the one here in Ash Lake a bit more because it plays with your expectations a little. The first Hydra is stuck in a comparatively small pond, so it can't move around. I figured this one would be more or less the same, but it turns out if you try to run away, it leaps to the other side of the lake to follow you. It can be a bit of a shock and impressive to see it make such an agile maneuver. You can still run away if you're persistent, but I think you're better off killing it since it doesn't respawn. Afterwards you can then enjoy the relaxing view of Ash Lake a little better. There's absolutely no rational way to explain the kind of scenery that we see here, so you just need to put logic aside and speculate. The more I think on it, the more I consider it to be the opposite of the area beneath the Nexus in Demon Souls. You might remember I said that the area in Demon's Souls looked very dreamlike, but when you think about it, it's entirely possible for it to be a real place which is simply underneath the Nexus. In Dark Souls, since the rest of the world is linked together logically, you innately feel that the same should be true for Ash Lake, but really that doesn't seem possible. It's more likely to be some other plane of existence entirely. I think this gives us a fair bit of insight into the world of Dark Souls in general. It clearly doesn't operate by the same rules as our own world, even on a fundamental level. The idea that all of Lordran and maybe the rest of the world is situated above this tree is borrowed from the world tree myth found in several mythologies. This, along with the pantheon of gods, gives me the impression that the world functions as though those myths were real. In other words, if you try to dial your mind back to a medieval or pre-medieval sort of time frame and imagine how they might have thought the world worked, that's the way it actually does work in Dark Souls. Fortunately, the core theme of the Age of Fire is a very timeless one. At the moment, research suggests that the most likely outcome for our own universe isn't dissimilar from that of Dark Souls, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was one of the considerations when crafting the story. The first two laws of thermodynamics are particularly applicable here. These have been phrased in many different ways over the years, but the simple versions are as follows. The first law states, energy cannot be created or destroyed, only changed from one form to another. The second law states, heat cannot spontaneously flow from a colder location to a hotter location. These might seem like simple facts, but according to all established science, they are very, very fundamental rules to our universe, and combined they have a large number of implications. Unfortunately, they paint a rather bleak future for the cosmos, where stars burn out and the amount of useful energy slowly depletes. Most of the heat from the sun is being jettisoned out into space, where it'll probably never do anything useful again. Eventually, after a very long time, all that's left is an incredibly vast, empty and cold universe. If this all sounds very abstract to you, that's normal, but therein lies the beauty of Dark Souls. The same rules, more or less, apply to stars as they do to a simple bonfire. You burn something, it heats up for a while, and then it's gone. It makes for a simple but powerful metaphor for the state of our own world. You can think of life and death the same way. Everything that lives eventually dies, and of course this is something we see a lot in Dark Souls as well. There's nothing we can do about any of this. Even if we had some way of becoming immortal, we'd eventually run out of resources, which is the kind of role the gods play in this game. Gwyn and the Witch of Izalith attempted to stop it in their own ways, but ultimately all they could do was delay the inevitable. Most of the other characters seem resigned to their fate, which makes a lot of sense. If there's nothing you can do to stop it, then the only thing left is to come to terms with it. I don't think Dark Souls is a particularly deep story, but its themes are so simplistic that they become engaging anyway. The main story uses these pieces as a backdrop, and the game has little reminders like bonfires and Estus which reinforce it and keep it in the forefront of your mind. The inevitability of death is something that affects us all, so no matter who you are, you can take something away from the story. Even in Ash Lake, these kinds of themes are reinforced by the sand you walk on. Since the everlasting dragons had stone scales, it seems likely that this is all that remains of them. One member of the everlasting dragons remains, which turns out to be another covenant. A curious thing about this is that you can cut off his tail and he won't even turn hostile. Considering how every other NPC works, this seems strange and gives me the impression that they just didn't have time to animate him as an enemy. This covenant is set up for duels, but there's already two other ways to do that which we've shown off, so it's a little redundant, although to be fair this one came along before the Colosseum. Anyway, my point is we're not going to bother showing this one off since we've fought enough for one video. Also, things got pretty existential there a minute ago, so to take your mind off the soul-crushing, inevitable heat death of the universe, we're going to frolic around as dragon friends. We've gone on quite a diversion since I killed the Bed of Chaos earlier, but it's finally time to get back to the main objective. There's 2 Lord Souls still to get, the next one will be Nito. Tomb of the Giants is an area I really like conceptually, but I think the execution probably could have used some more work. It feels like it never quite lives up to its potential, even though it's hard to point out any specific thing that went wrong. Still, I'm really happy and impressed that they actually followed through on the idea for a completely pitch black area. You almost never see realistically dark areas in games, and of course there's a good reason for that. When it's too dark to see, we primarily rely on our sense of touch to get around, which of course isn't replicated properly in games, at least not yet. Without it, there's a good chance a player would just run into a wall for 10 minutes without realising. I see the extremely limited light ring you get around your character as a way of simulating that sense of touch, but really you'll want a light source. There are only 3 of them, and each one has different pros and cons. The Sunlight Maggot is probably the best, since you just have to give up your helm for perpetual light. Cast Light also leaves your hands free, but costs you a spell slot and times out after a few minutes. It's the Skull Lantern which is the most interesting one. It costs your left hand, which is very punishing. It's the one you're most likely to find, but you're probably only going to use it if you have no better options. To make up for this a little bit, it lights up the edges of the cave, which can point you in the right direction. For a game as big as Dark Souls, I think it's great that there's only 3 options to light up this area, which are scattered across the entirety of Lordran. It's a great example of how much the designers trust you as the player. They trust you to explore the world, to take an interest in the items you're finding, and basically just to use your brain rather than charging in blindly. The glowing eyes on the skeletons are the one concession they make here, meaning you at least get some warning about an impending threat. It also makes for an unnerving moment the first time you move forward and see some eyes peering back at you in the dark, not being sure what they belong to. Later on, you might experience a similarly unnerving moment if you get the attention of the Black Knight in this area. You'll be able to hear the clunking of his armour but not be able to see him. It's also surprisingly difficult to memorise the layout of this place and find some of the hidden areas. All of these are some of the nice benefits of having a place shrouded in darkness like this. Being the Tomb of the Giants, it makes sense that the skeletons here would be giant, and I have no problem with these by themselves, but there is an extremely dangerous ambush room later on which is a bit over the top. If you're a ranged character, this isn't too bad, but good luck getting through here, otherwise you're going to need it. It's not exactly unfair, because if you're careful you can see it coming, but it feels like you're almost forced to use ranged attacks or items to make your way through this. A lot of people don't mind that, and I can certainly see the benefits of trying to push the player outside their comfort zone, but to me that feels like homogenization. As I was saying earlier, I prefer playing characters with specific strengths and weaknesses, but I feel this moment punishes certain playstyles a little too harshly compared to others. The skeletons here guard the large divine ember. I can see why they would want to give you something valuable for clearing this room, but I'm not sure this was the best placement for this item. Most of the other embers are placed very differently to this one. Take the crystal ember for example. You'll find it in the Duke's archives where the enemies are made of crystal. That makes perfect sense, but it also means the area you find it in is probably the worst area in the game to actually use it. There's not much point fighting crystal enemies with crystal weapons. You get the ember there so you can use it elsewhere, and the same is true for most others too. As we showed much earlier on, you get the original divine ember in the forest and can then use that to make the catacombs easier for yourself. With the large divine ember, its placement is just kind of boring and unnecessary by comparison. If you can manage to surmount all the skeletons in this room, then you've basically proved that you don't need the large divine ember anyway, and by the time you finish the rest of this area, its worth will be significantly diminished, since this is where it's the most useful. I only mention it here because it's easier to explain by using a bad example. This ember is the exception rather than the rule. I actually think the embers are some of the best placed items in the game by and large. Embers weren't necessary in Demon's Souls because that game was much smaller, so they didn't need to put so many locks on the upgrades, but it still had that sort of rock, paper, scissors design. There was lots of items in one area that would be useful elsewhere, so I think the placement of the embers in Dark Souls is one of the most Demon's Souls things about its design. Speaking of Demon's Souls, it's shortly after this we run into Patches for the second time. One curious thing about him is that he doesn't appear in Firelink Shrine until after you kill Nito, which has to come after acquiring the Lord Vessel. Despite that, when he returns to Firelink, he has dialogue warning you about Lautrec, whose storyline should be well finished at this point. I'm not sure whether this was an oversight or maybe a little touch of realism, since Patches doesn't know that you've already met Lautrec. At least since he warns you about Lautrec, and you should know by now that Lautrec really was unpleasant, it might make you take his warning about Petrus more seriously. It's an interesting little quirk, and I'd really like to know whether it was intentional or not. As I said earlier, he's pretty much the same as he was last time around, so I'm not going to dwell on him. Even if he doesn't kick you down the hole, you're probably going to want to go down there anyway to rescue Rhea and collect a few items.
This is what I do, my friend. The trinkets I'll be stripping off your corpse, that's the real treasure.
It's kind of funny how ultimately ineffectual he is. It makes it a little harder to hate him despite him obviously being horrible. The fact that Rhea is still lucid while her bodyguards have gone hollow just goes to show again that hollowing has more to do with mental fortitude than physical fitness. To save her, we have to kill Vince and Nico, and if you talk to Petrus while they're all at Firelink earlier, he says they were her schoolmates. It's not clear what percentage of the population turn undead after they die, but regardless, it seems pretty coincidental that they would all end up as undead. Interestingly, there's an item available later in this area that provides an alternate explanation which removes chance from the equation. Killing Paladin Leroy, who invades later on in this area, unlocks the Paladin set, which says, "Long ago, the Way of the White produced its first undead, a paladin in golden armour." The word produced stands out here as though they found some way to artificially induce undeath in people. If that's the case, then it's entirely possible the Way of the White had Vince and Nico intentionally turned undead so they could continue to guard Rhea, and it may have even been done to Rhea herself. Coming up after this, we have my most hated enemy in Dark Souls, the Crawling Skeletons. They are in a late game area, so they should be somewhat difficult, but I find them to be considerably more punishing than any other enemy when taken on 1v1. Since they seem to obey the same rules as the other enemies, I wouldn't say they're broken or unfair or anything, I just don't find them fun to fight against. They do have a clear amount of vulnerability after they do their most dangerous attack, but otherwise they have an incredible amount of stamina, especially considering they're just a skeleton. I think they go to show what a delicate balancing act the enemy design is. If the enemy is too easy, then the player won't be satisfied after they kill them, and if they're too hard, then the frustration might outweigh that satisfaction. It could just be I find these particularly difficult because I play a close range character. You'll notice it's not that bad for the Pyromancer here, but there are other areas which are a bit more difficult for her. Personally, I find the Duke's Archives to be a relatively easy place, but apparently she doesn't. Another major item we can find here is the Silver Serpent Ring, but I'd say this suffers from the same issue as the Large Divine Ember. It boosts the number of souls dropped by enemies, but if you can get down here and find this thing, you probably don't need it anymore anyway. At least that's one benefit to having a New Game Plus mode. Things you pick up on your first playthrough might be a little more useful the second time around. If you want to get more use out of it, there's a little trick you can do with this one without having to have it equipped all the time. After you kill a boss, there's a delay before you gain their souls, and it turns out if you equip this ring in that short interval, then you get the boosted amount of souls anyway. I'm guessing this is unintentional, so I don't use it myself, but it's an interesting little exploit. It just goes to show how many little edge cases and considerations need to be factored in when designing. I think it's one thing that might have slipped past the quality assurance team because it doesn't actually cause any real problems. A bit further in, around the area where Leroy invades, you can see Ash Lake in the distance, which might act as a clue that there is another area if you missed it. You can also see Izalith earlier on, but you can't get to either of those places from here. Each of the branches that opens up after Ornstein and Smough results in a dead end, which you'll probably warp back from, which is a bit disappointing after the intricate level design of the first half. In fact, the boss rooms for the Four Kings, Bed of Chaos and Nito are all set up in such a way that you have to warp out of them once you walk into them. I love walking from one place to another to avoid interruptions to my experience, but it's just not enjoyable or possible to do at this point thanks to the level design. Obviously, I would prefer if the entire game was more tightly woven together, but it is hard to blame them too much for this. It's just a simple fact that the larger the game world becomes, the harder it is to tie it all together cohesively like that. Still, I can't help but feel if Tomb of the Giants had somehow connected to Lost Izalith and Ash Lake, that it would go a long way towards solving the problem. New Londo is fine the way it is, since it links directly from Firelink Shrine and Valley of the Drakes, which would just leave the Duke's Archives as the only dead end then. There would be lots of different difficulties to contend with though to make Tomb of the Giants connect to those other areas. They would have to make the areas line up somewhat so that it actually makes sense, accommodate the load times that would be a factor as well, and make the art transition smoothly from drastically different environments. I'm sure there's a relatively simple reason why they didn't do that, even if it was just time constraints, but it's nice to daydream nonetheless. Just along here, there's an interesting moment with two skeletons. Their placement is set up in such a way that the one with the bow draws your attention, giving the other one a chance to kick you off the cliff, like so. I've done this bit a bunch of times now, so I'm pretty sure the skeleton on the left has some unique scripting which makes it much more likely to use the kick attack when it first sees you. There are a few other instances of somewhat similar scripting, like the hollows in the Undead Burg, which will only lob firebombs until you get close, but this is definitely something I'd like to see more of. It's just a case of the enemy being more intelligent about which attacks they decide to use. I find it satisfying to play against, and it makes the enemies that little bit less repetitive, even if they're of the exact same type. It also feels innately fair because even if you rush forward, you should still have time to see the attack animation coming if you're paying attention. Right before Nito, this room with the bowing skeletons makes for a great visual set piece. This gives me the impression of a creepy ritual long ago where everybody died at exactly the same time as they were praying. However, my assistant has a different view. She imagines that skeletons come here to bow down to Nito after they die. Both of these are equally valid and interesting theories, and I think this goes to show how you can easily interpret things differently. This is one of the many advantages of ambiguous storytelling. I saw this as a disturbing ritual because that was the explanation which resonated most strongly with me. This is the last time I'll point this out, but I think the skeleton babies are another good example of what makes the art direction of Dark Souls a little bit different. Obviously, being attacked by the skeletons of long since dead children is a pretty disturbing idea, but they don't look particularly horrifying. In fact, they look kind of cute with their big heads and the way they waddle as they walk. It's a dark concept, but not anywhere near as overtly grotesque as the similar stuff you'll see in Demon's Souls or Bloodborne. This doesn't make Dark Souls better or worse, it's just different. For my part, I really enjoy the atmosphere in this game and don't feel it gets quite enough credit in that regard. Coming up, we have Nito, described as the first of the dead in the introduction. This one was a bit of a mixed bag for me. I have a soft spot for necromancers, but I don't like things which force you to take damage, and dealing with the giant skeletons can be very frustrating. I've warmed to it a lot recently though, since I've realised, even though it uses some gameplay mechanics I'm not fond of, it does them in a pretty unique and clever way. This boss fight is a glorified trap. When you enter this fight, a specific set of things happens which is designed solely to induce panic. First, you're forced to drop from a great height, taking a huge amount of damage. Your instincts will probably tell you to heal immediately, but you'll likely be hit from underneath, negating the use of your Estus. Still on low health, you look around, trying to discern where you're being attacked from, but the boss arena is built in a unique way. The cave is set up in such a way that it obscures the boss from your vision, and it's the only boss arena that does this. Nito himself has an extremely slow movement speed compared to other bosses, so he doesn't appear in front of you right away. Not knowing where the boss is, and faced with the prospect of getting skewered from underneath again, your first instinct is probably to run, either to escape or to find the enemy. Unfortunately for you, running is the absolute worst thing you can do during this fight. The further you get into the boss arena, the more skeletons you'll wake up and the harder the battle will become. Over and over, this game will punish you for rushing in blindly or not thinking things through, and here it's no different. This is the ultimate test of your ability to be calm under pressure, your nerves. It's only when you finally hold out, decide to wait here and assess the situation, that you'll be rewarded. Nito will slowly wander over to you and the boss fight will be significantly easier. I don't have access to any statistics or playtesting data, so I can't say exactly how many players panic at this point, but if you ask me, this accomplishes exactly what it sets out to do. This room is the one we showed earlier by entering the sarcophagus, and funnily enough, if you die here, you can actually still go back there and re-enter this room from there. Nito will be back in the coffin, you can still offer things to him, and you can even pick up your bloodstain. If you die to this boss and you're worried about getting your souls back, that's always an option. Unfortunately, we do ultimately have to kill Nito to progress though. Personally, I think of him as one of the most neutral characters in the story. Having a god of death is a common thing in polytheism, and they're rarely portrayed as outright evil. Presumably, someone has to fulfill this role in the world of Dark Souls, and as far as I can see, Nito isn't being especially malicious towards anybody in particular. With Nito even more dead than before, the only remaining Lord Soul we need is from the Four Kings. We haven't fulfilled all the requirements to get to them though. First of all, we need to head back to Darkroot. There's a lot of AI controlled forest hunters here, which is another one of those things that allows you to get a little taste of the Covenants even if you can't get online. When the game was first released, you couldn't lock on to the Forest Phantoms here, which made this area much more difficult, but not really in a good way. It was really just meaningless frustration. I do tend to ramble on sometimes about how the proliferation of the internet has allowed developers to get lazier or milk post-release content for more money, but of course there are upsides. I get the impression, even if the team had another year of development time, these enemies probably still would have been untargetable when the game launched. It's the kind of thing that got changed thanks to the feedback they were able to gather once the public got their hands on it. Sometimes that feedback can be dangerous because people don't always know what they want or don't have the best interests of other players in mind, but as long as the development team are willing to stick to their vision, it probably does more good than harm. As with any advancement in technology, it's never really the technology that's the problem, just a matter of how it's used. The Forest Hunters are one of the more popular Covenants, at least partially because they're the only Covenant with a consistent reward system. Anytime a Forest Defender kills an intruder, they're randomly rewarded with one of a few potential items, mainly Titanite shards and chunks. It's nice to see the online interactions be incentivized with in-game rewards, but if anything they have this reward system backwards. Invaders already have an incentive to invade, the sheer fun of it. They risk little or nothing and gain the opportunity to kill another player. The people who really need to be incentivized to participate in online interactions are the potential victims. You can gain some souls by killing an invader, sometimes too many souls, but that isn't an especially interesting or tempting reward. For every person that loves invading, there's someone else who will go to the trouble of disconnecting their console from the internet to avoid that kind of thing. I appreciate how much more ambitious they were with the online this time around, but it has its pros and cons. With the unexpected level of success Demon Souls had, they knew there would be a substantial amount of players for Dark Souls, but even so I feel like they pushed their luck when it came to the Covenants. For each online Covenant, the online player base is splintered. Despite that, there are, or at least were, enough active players for this not to be a problem. As it is now, there are 6 main ways for players to fight one another in this game. The Forest Hunters, the Path of the Dragon, the Blades of the Dark Moon, the Dark Wraiths, the Battle of Stoicism, and the Red Soapstone. Keep in mind that doesn't include battling a Gravelord, coming across an invader while you're trying to do co-op, or even just keeping yourself in human form, which is basically an invite to invasion. The 6 main methods all have their little quirks, of course, but more or less they're all the same core experience. You go head to head against an enemy player. I can't say that any of them are particularly bad or unnecessary, and some players will prefer one method to another, but you have to admit there's some redundancy there. As the player base starts to dwindle, this becomes a bigger problem. Even if 2 players want to battle, they might be attempting to do so via different methods, which means they won't be able to. In other words, if I'm using the Red Soapstone and you're at the Battle of Stoicism, we can't be paired up even though we essentially want to do the same thing. This wasn't an issue last time around, especially since Shrine of Storms became the designated battle zone. If you wanted to do a duel, you knew exactly where to go and what method to use. It's nice that Covenants give players more options, but they just don't feel particularly meaningful to me. I think it could have benefited from some more restraint. A few really good Covenants would be much better than a large number of simplistic ones. It's mainly thanks to the runaway success of Dark Souls that this didn't become a bigger issue, so I think in that sense the team were lucky that the game caught on as much as it did. My biggest problem with the Forest Hunters is the way the level matching works. If you're in the Covenant, there's no upper limit on the level of people who you can end up fighting against. Gear makes the biggest difference, but levels do make a big difference too, especially when you're talking about several hundred. Even the basic level matching can feel unfair sometimes when the other player has much better gear than you, so it boggles my mind that they decided such extreme differences would be okay here. It throws all sense of fairness out the window. Even though the player essentially has to opt into it by being in the Forest Hunter Covenant, it's just not the kind of thing I would expect or hope to see in this game. I know what I would change to make this more balanced myself. I think every weapon should have a soul cost associated with it so that the game can keep track of the cost of all your equipment you have on you at the moment. It would then tally up the cost of your equipment, your upgrades and your levels and only pit you against players in a similar range. That would stop players from decking out low-level characters and destroying new players, and overall make it a more balanced experience. That is, assuming the soul numbers attached to the weapons and armor are reasonable enough. If this number was viewable from the menu, then players could even manipulate themselves to move up or down in value as they see fit, making it a bit more flexible than it is now with the level matching. I think all that sounds good, but the downside is players would need to be blocked from changing equipment or none of it would work. Since players can be invaded at any time, the only way to do that would be to limit inventory management to the bonfires. Personally, I would really like that, as it would be a nice little touch of realism, but I get the feeling most people would be against it because it would be seen as a hassle. I like to think of it another way. I think it would bring some interesting decision making into the equation if there was only so much you could take with you until the next bonfire. You might disagree, but one thing I would hope everyone could agree on is that matchmaking should be as fair as possible. I absolutely respect anyone who can get late game equipment on low level characters, but I don't think that gives you the right to automatically destroy other low level players. The winner should always be the better player. Up next we have Sif. Since I saved him in the past, I get a slightly extended cutscene where he recognizes me, but I still have to fight him anyway. For whatever reason, he has his mission to guard this grave and will stick to it no matter what, even if he knows you're a friend. If another team had made this game, they might have given you some secret way to avoid this fight, but I'm really glad they didn't. It's not something you're supposed to enjoy doing, but for a game about the inevitable death of everyone and everything, it would be a bit of a cop-out to give you a way around killing Sif, just because it makes you feel bad. The animations on this boss are especially worthy of praise, first of all because animators spend most of their time on bipedal creatures. Most of them don't have nearly as much experience with quadrupeds. It's obvious Sif's animations couldn't be motion captured either, since no real dog could do the things he does, so this all must have been done by hand. The sheer size of him poses another problem as well. The bigger an enemy is, the more obvious any problems with its animations are. If you're paying attention, you can certainly notice when Sif snaps sometimes from one animation into the next, but it's no worse than it is for any other enemy or boss, which is pretty impressive given the challenges they had here. It was pretty ambitious of them to attempt this in the first place, and not only that, but to rely on Sif's animations to sell an emotional gut punch at the end when he starts limping. I think this fight is a good example of Dark Souls being greater than the sum of its parts. Everything about this boss is good in and of itself. It's visually unique and eye-catching, it moves differently to other bosses, and the music is one of the better compositions which really fits the mood. Since Sif just attacks using the sword, there's a massive dead zone underneath him where you'll probably be safe, but occasionally he'll jump away and force you to reposition yourself. From a gameplay perspective, it could be better, but it could be a lot worse too. It's really the way all these elements come together that turn this into a very memorable fight. Take away any of them and it just wouldn't be as special. The only thing I'd change here is the threshold at which Sif begins to limp. I think it should have been raised so that players would be more likely to see it. As it is now, it's entirely possible to kill him too quickly and miss this. Making that sort of change would reduce the challenge of course, but they could have even just boosted his HP to accommodate that. Anyway, the thing I like about this fight is it goes to show you don't necessarily have to sacrifice gameplay to pull at a player's heartstrings. Even without any of the emotional baggage that goes along with this fight, it would still be pretty enjoyable regardless. They definitely deserve credit for not letting story elements get in the way of making a good game first and foremost. After this fight, we can find the Hornet Ring on a corpse behind Artorias' gravestone. The ring belonged to Kieran and the corpse is female, so I think we can assume it's her. This does raise some questions if you killed her in the past, but I suppose it's not unreasonable to imagine her corpse ended up here somehow regardless. I think we can also assume that Go is dead in this time frame as well, so with that it brings a close to the story of Gwyn's Elite Knights. One of the more interesting and well executed pieces of lore in Dark Souls, I think. Thanks to the time travel, we get a better sense of their personality and closure on all of their stories. After making my way through the first half of New Londo, as the Pyromancer did earlier, talking with Ingward will now allow me to progress further. I remember the first time I played I had an inkling that something was up with all the water here, but turning the wheel and exposing more of New Londo was still enjoyable nonetheless. This is an area which doesn't hold up quite as well on repeat playthroughs because the layout isn't particularly complex, but it's worth it for the satisfaction of discovering the second half. New Londo looks sort of mysterious and elegant above the water, but once you get down lower you see the true horror and start to view the place differently. After you open the gate, some of the bodies get strewn into the Valley of Drakes, which is a nice little touch. Most of the corpses seem to be concentrated in this area, but it's hard to say why. Of all the things to get heated about, discussing the placement of these corpses is actually the biggest argument the two of us had when making this video. After realising how absurd it was to fight over the placement of a few corpses in a computer game, I eventually decided that my theory was objectively superior in every single way. I think the corpses must have mostly settled here by the time you open the gate, and that their placement is meant to imply the people were all crowded here before the end for whatever reason. An alternative way of looking at it, if you really want to, is that the corpses were all carried here when the water drained out, but there's a big mound of them which is difficult to explain with that theory. I'm not convinced the flooding of New Londo was as well thought out as some of the other stuff in the game, so it's hard to say for sure and probably not really worth arguing about. The Dark Wraiths were originally the Knights of New Londo, and while they might look evil now, you can't really take that for granted. As we'll see shortly, the story of Dark Souls is a little more complicated than it might appear on the surface. If you want to become a Dark Wraith yourself, you have to complete this area, which means killing the 4 kings. Overall, it's pretty hard to become an invader in this game early on, since the boss here is one of the more difficult ones. As I said earlier, I think balancing should always be a concern, even for invasions, but I still really like invasions as a concept, even though I only occasionally do them myself. With how easy it is for people to avoid them, I really don't think this also needed the roadblock of being one of the most difficult covenants to get to. The entrance to the 4 Kings is another one of those areas where Dark Souls places a lot of faith in the player. The ring you need to walk through the abyss is very far away from here, but you're still expected to discover it and use it here with only a few hints. The only catch is the fog gate, which traps you here before you've had a chance to realise there's a problem, meaning even if you realise you'll need an item from somewhere else, you have no way of obtaining it. I can see how they got themselves into this bind though. They could have just set this area up like Seath, where the fog door only appears after you first fight the boss, but that would have its own problems. The fog door provides a crucial hint that something important is supposed to happen here. Without it, many of us probably would have just ignored this drop and gotten stuck as a result. Ultimately, despite its problems, the fog door ends up being the better choice since it forces the player off the ledge. I really like the way the abyss itself was executed. There really isn't a better representation of the concept than just a vast void of black nothingness. It also has the bonus effect of depriving you of your sense of perspective too. You have no way of knowing how close you are to the first of the 4 kings until you get right up in front of him. It's a bit of a surreal moment, and I'm surprised I haven't seen any other game do this until now, considering what a simple trick it is, although it's not like I've played every other game ever made, so who knows. The battle against the 4 kings is a race against time since they can all be active at once, and if it gets to that point, it's incredibly difficult to come back from it. This is an especially difficult feat for me since I'm not particularly damage orientated, which is why I've left them until last. The bosses aren't quite as novel as the ones in Demon Souls, but I still appreciate the time that went into differentiating them from one another, particularly the ones in the second half. The 4 kings, Nito and Ornstein and Smo are all multi-enemy bosses, but you'll need totally different strategies for each one. Even outside of those, the way you'll approach a boss like Priscilla needs to be very different to how you'll fight Gwendolyn. The core combat of these games is pretty repetitive given how limited the player's moveset is, but the boss fights compensate for this by forcing you to approach things in a different way. The way the 4 kings have been programmed means you can actually end up fighting 5 of them depending on what kind of damage you're doing. This seems like a strange oversight, and it's a good example of what I was saying at the start about it being difficult to discern what is and isn't intentional in games. I highly doubt they intended for there to be a possible 5 kings in this fight, and if something that big can slip through the cracks, it makes you wonder what else might be unintentional as well. The soul that they drop has an interesting description. It says, Lord Gwyn recognised the foresight of these 4 great leaders of New Londo, and granted them their ranks and the fragments of a great soul. Foresight is a bit of a strange word there. It seems like the 4 kings understood something which nobody else did. This must have been before the creation of the Dark Wraiths though, so it's hard to say what exactly this refers to. Really, I think they just wanted an excuse for one of the Lord Souls to be in possession of someone who was sided with the Dark, but it's an interesting thing to mull over anyway. Because I did the 4 kings last, nothing particular happens once I've beaten them. However, if you're more daring and do them much earlier on, then you get to meet Kath. Kath is probably the most vital NPC when it comes to understanding the overall story of this game. The best way to explain it is just to let his dialogue speak for itself.
Greetings, undead warrior. I am the primordial serpent, Darkstalker Kath. I can guide thee and illuminate the truth. The truth I shall share without sentiment. After the advent of fire, the ancient lords found the three souls, but your progenitor found a fourth, unique soul, the Dark Soul. Your ancestor claimed the Dark Soul and waited for fire to subside, and soon the flames did fade, and only dark remained. Thus began the Age of Men, the Age of Dark. However, Lord Gwyn trembled at the dark, clinging to his Age of Fire and in dire fear of humans, and the Dark Lord who would one day be born amongst them. Lord Gwyn resisted the course of nature by sacrificing himself to link the fire and commanding his children to shepherd the humans. Gwyn has blurred your past to prevent the birth of the Dark Lord. I am the primordial serpent. I seek to right the wrongs of the past, to discover our true Lord. But the other serpent, Frampt, lost his sense and befriended Lord Gwyn. Undead warrior, we stand at a crossroads. Only I know the truth about your fate. You must destroy the fading Lord Gwyn, who has coddled fire and resisted nature, and become the fourth Lord, so that you may usher in an age of dark. Very well. I shall now guide you to Gwyn's prison. Be still, and trust thine flesh to me.
The first time you play the game, you're not likely to come across Kath, and this seems intentional to me. You take Frampt at face value and most likely complete the mission that's been handed to you from the start. Darkness is usually associated with evil in most things, and Dark Souls uses this preconception to trick you. In Dark Souls, the dark isn't any more good or evil than the alternative. While the fire ending might not necessarily be bad in and of itself, the way Frampt leads you towards it is somewhat manipulative. You're not really told what will happen, so your character ends up burning themselves alive. You could argue though that this is a release for your character, since it probably destroys them completely, which is arguably a better fate than going hollow. Kath seems more serious and also more open about things. He acknowledges Frampt and seems to give you more insight into what's going on, although we can't ignore the possibility that he could be lying about things. Since Kath represents the Dark Lord ending, it may be that he's trying to gather up as much humanity as possible to recreate the Dark Soul. You can offer humanity to him, and in reward, the Dark Hand allows you to suck more humanity from your victims, up to a maximum of 10 at a time. If you choose his ending, you'll become the Dark Lord, but it's not entirely clear what that entails. Possibly the death of the gods and the rise of man, but it's hard to envision it with all the fires gone out. The fire ending seems like the worst ending at a glance, but it's important to note that Kath is most likely the one responsible for the disaster in Oolacile, so it's not entirely clear cut which answer is the right one. It was never intended to be that simplistic anyway. Whatever the case, I think it worked out well to present the story like this. If they had made Kath and his side of the story more obvious, then they would be under more pressure to pit the two snakes against one another and pull the player in two directions. For a first playthrough, it's probably best just to keep things simple given how sparse the presentation is. I also just like seeing hidden content like this. It takes advantage of games as a medium by presenting things in a format which is impossible elsewhere. Whoever you decide to go with in the end, and whichever ending you think is the best case scenario, what's clear is that your character is caught up in something much, much larger than themselves. The primordial serpents are the puppet masters of Dark Souls. You can choose to trust one of them, or think for yourself instead, but either way you have to make the choice in the end. With all of the Lord Souls acquired, all that's left now is to place the souls and do the final boss. There are lots of really nice scenes visually in Dark Souls, but this one has to be one of my favourites despite how simple it is. Just a white area where the souls of Gwyn's knights are left wandering. I think this is quite impactful because the knights are used as recurring enemies throughout the entire game, so you're well used to seeing them at this point. Now that you're nearly finished, you get to see them in a different light, which might make you think about them a little differently. What I really like here though is how organically this is done. It's just an area, not a cutscene, and even the way the area itself is presented is nothing special really. A lot of games these days will try to go for environmental storytelling or scripted sequences which are supposed to feel more natural, but really they never stop holding your hand. I think many lesser developers would have forced the player to go through this area at a walking pace or something obnoxious like that. Putting arbitrary restrictions like that on the player feels a little bit like treating them like a child. You're telling them that this place is too important to run around. Thankfully, there's no such restrictions here. If you like, you can just run right through here and ignore everything around you. I think one of the main reasons I pay more attention and get more engaged in the story of Dark Souls compared to many other games is because it treats me like an adult. When I'm treated with respect, I'm happy to return the favour. It's not hard to see why so many people get so attached to these games when you take that mutual respect into account. At the killing itself, I think the ash is supposed to imply that Gwyn burned his knights to prolong the flame, and as you can see by the sheer volume, quite a lot of stuff has been incinerated to keep the Age of Fire going. It looks like the spirits of those knights haven't wandered very far from what used to be their bodies. There's only a few living knights here, which makes this one of the easiest areas in the game. I can see why they wouldn't want people to get frustrated by the walk back to Gwyn, but they still probably could have crammed a final climactic area in here, then added a second bonfire. The latter half of the game tends to get easier and easier for you, since the areas are roughly similar in difficulty, whereas your character keeps growing in ability. This would have been a nice opportunity to put the player's skills even further to the test with a more difficult area. Bloodborne manages to do this a little bit better, so maybe they've since realised that this was a bit of a wasted opportunity. I don't really mind it myself because I'm not too hung up on the difficulty, but I know a lot of players will be expecting a harder area here and be let down. Still, the art direction here is fantastic, and you get the unmistakable sense that this will be the final area regardless of the challenge. Given its theme, I can't think of a better way to end Dark Souls than in a huge mountain of ash. It's a perfect setting for the finale. The last boss is of course Gwyn himself. He never says a word to us, just attacking on sight, which I think has led a lot of people to believe he's gone hollow, but I don't see it that way myself. The game seems to go out of its way to maintain the fact that hollowing is a specifically human thing. We never see any non-humans in a hollow state. Even if you think back to Ulasil, the people there were obviously inflicted with something else entirely. Artorias has gone mad, but doesn't seem to be hollow exactly, and despite the fact that many NPC storylines end in hollowing, Dusk, Kieran and Go are never shown to hollow either. The other possibility, which I think is much more compelling, is that Gwyn is just tired or uninterested in talking to the player. He has too much pride to let go of his hold on the world, even though his time has clearly come and gone. There's nothing more to say about it, and it's entirely possible you're not the first person to wander down here and try your luck against him anyway. People like to talk about how easy Gwyn is, which I wouldn't entirely disagree with. He's not as challenging as anything in Ulasil or some of the other bosses, but I don't think he's a pushover either. Funnily enough, he's actually the only boss that killed me more than once on this playthrough. I had a fair bit of trouble with him on my first playthrough too, but of course once I realised I could parry him, he became a lot easier. I'm sure many people had a similar experience. I love the soundtrack for this battle, which evokes just the right atmosphere. You know things are serious when the composer busts out the piano track. I'd say the strength of the piece that plays here is the reason why they never had to write any dialogue for Gwyn. It says everything that needs to be said. Just a battle against a tired man who needs to be put out of his misery. With Gwyn dead, there's just the matter of the ending. You can either relight the fire or walk away. We'll be showing both endings here. I'm going to reignite the fire and she's going to let it die out. I'm assuming they intended for most players to get the fire ending first, since your instinct after beating a boss is to light the bonfire, but I don't think that makes the other ending any less valid. There's certainly an argument to be made that it's ultimately better for everyone to stop prolonging the inevitable. Both ending sequences are a little abrupt, but it's probably better they close it out quickly rather than try to explain too much and ruin the mystery. It's the kind of thing that leaves you wondering, which is a pretty good fit for this game. Naturally, I made a lot of comparisons to Demon's Souls throughout this video, and a lot of those comparisons weren't especially favourable for Dark Souls. I think Demon's Souls had a better online system, more novel bosses, and a better sense of polish and completeness when it came to its world. Comparing the two for this video has given me more respect for Demon's Souls than I already had. However, that said, I still prefer Dark Souls myself. It's a somewhat messier game, but as far as I'm concerned, it has enough ambition to make up for it. It's clear they didn't want to just churn out a carbon copy sequel to Demon's Souls. They genuinely tried to make some significant improvements and changes along the way. Some of those, like the interconnected level design, were a success. Others, like the Covenants, were more of a mixed bag. It has more rough edges, but I also think the bright spots shine more brilliantly too. Well, there you have it. It was a long journey, but it's all over now. If you managed to stick it out all this way without going hollow, give yourself a pat on the back. I'm truly grateful for all your time, and I hope you managed to get something out of it in return. Even though it's been such a long video, I'm having a bit of a hard time signing off. I just can't actually believe that this is the end. I don't really have anything else to say, but I'm not really sure what way to finish this after it's been such a long time. I think I'll just have to take my cue from the game and stop delaying the inevitable. It's not like I have anything else to say anyway, so I'm just going to do my usual send-off. I hope I'll see you next time, and thanks for watching.
There is a video game that doesn't exist. It's a myth, an urban legend, a hoax. It's called Polybius, and you might have heard of it. Let me take you back to 1981, back when arcade games were at their peak. A multi-billion-dollar industry and a fever that had a grip on pop culture. Video arcades were a new social nexus and had sprung up everywhere. Dimly lit by neon light, adorned with garish carpet, they played host both to crowds of teenagers and cabinet after cabinet of the hottest games of the era. Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Donkey Kong, Galaga. However, in an unnamed arcade in some sleepy suburb of Portland, there lurked something more obscure. A limited release of a game that would evaporate as silently as it appeared. The stories are vague. The cabinet is described as plain, and the gameplay? Weird looking, abstract, fast action with puzzle elements. Sometimes it's described as being particularly addictive, despite the unassuming appearance. The only concrete details are the name, year of release, and the company behind it. Polybius, 1981, Zinnis Lotion. Really, it was just like any other arcade machine, except for the side effects. Reports of sickness, amnesia, night terrors, and behavioural changes followed those who played it. It was no accident either, if you believe the rumours. Instead, a secret project by a government agency, developed from military tech for the CIA or some other men in black. The machines were observed, gameplay records were taken, and then, after a month or so, they disappeared without notice, along with any shred of evidence. To this day, no authentic cabinets, boards, or dumped ROMs have surfaced. But there are some who claim to hold them. Quite the yarn. But could there be any merit to this myth? or even a basis in truth. It's probably safe to assume that the story has been subject to quite some embellishment. The accounts are full of conjecture and weasel words, supposedly, according to, etc. One thing remains consistent across all the stories, and that's the name. Polybius. Why Polybius? It's not novel, it belongs to a Greek of some repute, a prominent historian born in Megalopolis, Arcadia. This could be a deliberate choice to muddy search queries about the game, or perhaps it was chosen on its own merits. Polybius covered the Romans' rise to power in detail, an important primary source and an early example of rigor in historiography. He also lends his name to a simple cipher, the Polybius square, in which letters are substituted by their coordinates on a grid. Altogether, this doesn't tell us much, although the meaning of the name is interesting. The poly prefix means many, and bios, life. Many lives, from Arcadia. Convenient. It could be a coincidence, but we can assume whoever named the game has at least some knowledge of either history or cryptography. Real or not, the name was chosen. Another word consistent to the myth is the supposed developer or publisher, Zinnes Lotion. It's a German word, almost. A not quite grammatical combination of Sinne, meaning sense, and Lotion, meaning to erase. To erase senses, to become senseless. It seems to allude to the mythical side effects of Polybius, which implies a deliberate choice. It's almost certainly not a real company, as there are no other games attributed to them, nor any trace of company records. So Polybius could be of German origin, but the incorrect grammar might also indicate the use of machine translation, something chosen by a non-native speaker to sound suitably obscure or sinister. There isn't much visual evidence for the game, and most can be discounted as fake. But there is one screenshot that is consistently upheld as canon. It's rather basic, a black background with a Polybius logo, copyright information and credits, and nothing else. However, compared to contemporary games from 1981, one thing stands out. The logo is unusually large and detailed. Back then, fancy graphics were confined to the printed marquees. Every kilobyte of the ROM was valuable, so most game titles were rendered in the standard font, or at a much smaller scale. This did change over the next few years, and by 1983, larger, more lavishly designed title screens were more common. The closest match in terms of style might be from Nintendo. Their games favour large, bold titles with similar lettering. Perhaps Polybius drew inspiration from Versus Pinball or Duck Hunt. Of course, both of these date to 1984, which makes Polybius' 1981 claimed year of release look spurious. Perhaps it was just ahead of its time. Another detail from this screenshot is the font used for the smaller text. Those with a keen eye might recognise a similarity to those used by Williams games, such as Defender or Robotron. And it's definitely a close match, but they're not identical. The smallest 5-pixel high text does match Robotron, but the larger 7-pixel text does not. There is one game that comes closer. Nearly a perfect match. And while still a Williams title, it's the much less well-known Bubbles. It's still not a pixel-perfect fit, but it is closer than any other. The minor differences could be attributed to font hinting, JPEG artifaction, or perhaps a deliberate alteration. In any case, the text is distinctly Williams. Either Polybius is some lost prototype, or the image was fabricated by someone who drew influence from their games. The screenshot has been around for almost as long as the myth, and is likely the original source for the turquoise bubble-lettered logo. It doesn't exactly give us much to go on, and it certainly doesn't reveal what the gameplay might have been like. There are some that claim to reveal more of Polybius, such as these Vector-esque images distributed on the now-defunct PolybiusLives.com. First emerging around April in 2008, there's little supporting evidence for their veracity. All signs point to a fan-made creation. Besides, it doesn't make sense. If you had the ROMs and were able to take screenshots of a functioning game, why not show it in motion? To see the game running would be a revelation. There have been multiple people who claim to hold the Polybius ROMs, and yet there's no sign of them anywhere. However, there is no shortage of gameplay footage out there, but these are all fan-made interpretations, impressions of what Polybius may have been like. One of the first emerged around April 2004, distributed by a site called GoodDealGames.com, the original source unknown. With a spooky icon, it's clearly supposed to evoke the myth, and those who are brave enough to run it are given a warning. The Polybius video game has been linked to impaired memory and psychological changes. Gameplay may cause epileptic seizures in susceptible individuals. Do you still want to continue? Click OK, and you'll be met with the familiar title screen, reformatted for a 4:3 monitor, with the logo rapidly flashing while a sound effect plays, a sequence of rising tones. The flashing continues until you press a key. And then, nothing. The game exits with a fatal error, and a message box that reads, "April Fools, send this urban legend to a friend." Interestingly enough, if you take the executable into a hex editor, you'll find the 2 MB file is not quite what it seems. The first 10 kilobytes consist of some data, but the rest? Empty space, acres of zeros, terminated with a few bytes of text. April Fools. So we can write that one off as an obvious joke. But there is another game that has become the dominant example when searching for Polybius gameplay. It came from a site at Zinnislotion.com, the supposed developers of the original. But the site explains that it's just a fan-made attempt to recreate what might have been. Launch the executable and you're presented with the obligatory warning screens. Do not play this game, etc. And ominous mentions of cognitive interfaces and higher functions. A familiar logo appears, but this is no mere prank. There's an actual game amidst all the spooky theatrics. The gameplay is admittedly simple, giving you control of a ship that can move in, out, or rotate the playfield. Like the original legend insists, there's more to the game than simple shooting. Glowing shapes bearing numbers appear, and if these numbers match either digit appearing on the base, or are evenly divisible, then you'll reduce the base's number by that amount. Once the base reaches 0, you advance on to the next level, where the visuals get progressively trippier. Aside from the puzzle element, the gameplay resembles vector games like Tempest or Star Castle, although some aspects are inconsistent with vector graphics, such as the swirling backgrounds. Entering the code 35, 34, 31, 54, 12, 24, 45, 43, the code that corresponds to Polybius on a Polybius square, grants access to the higher game functions. There's a host of extra settings here, some relating to auditory entrainment, subliminals, and color strobe, which disable some elements of the game. Others are more fanciful, however. REM imprinting, gameplay amnesia, operant paradigm triggers. Countless settings designed to inspire the right level of paranoia. Cracking open the executable's resources reveals the game was made in Dark Basic, a game creation tool. Using a more specialized tool called Dark Explorer, we can reveal all of the game's assets, graphics, sound effects, etc. All of these subliminal aspects are laid bare. A variety of messages written in dark grey flashed briefly during gameplay. Obey, consume, submit. It's like something straight out of They Live. The sound effects are similar. Most are synthetic tones, but some feature voice recordings and sounds of breathing. Presumably, these are played at a barely audible level.
Why don't you play? Try the game. Try the game. Try the game.
Altogether, a pretty neat package for those who want to build their own Polybius cabinet. But who's behind it? The credits hidden in the Higher Functions menu give us some insight. Igor Uspeny's PhD, and a mysterious number sequence. 4, 8, 15, 16, 23, 42. The numbers should be familiar if you've ever watched Lost. And it turns out the name is equally cryptic. It's an anagram of Rogue Synapse. The Whois data for ZinnisLotion.com lists an email from the domain GorkaWeb.com, which in turn links to RogueSynapse.com. It's the site of an arcade enthusiast with a particular passion for recreating fictional arcade games, such as Space Paranoids seen in Tron, or the eponymous cabinet from The Last Starfighter. It's a fantastic fan-made project, but as far as the Polybius myth is concerned, it's just a tribute. With the explosion of indie developers over the last decade, there have been quite a few other interpretations made, both for desktop and mobile. There was even a version made for the Atari 2600, with very limited distribution at the Retro Gaming Expo 2013. Few of these later examples make any claims of authenticity, and they generally follow a simple shoot-'em-up formula. One particularly recent game that bears the Polybius name is Jeff Minter's version for PSVR. Minter is a veteran game dev long noted for his unusual games and light synths. Since 1981, he's been responsible for a steady stream of psychedelic experiences. Polybius stays true to the Minter mold, and with the rapidly strobing colours and breakneck pace of gameplay, you can see why the game has pretty strong warnings before you start. Its pulsating visuals and trance soundtrack mesh together to keep you in the zone. But its intentions are benevolent, with subliminal messages reminding players of the virtues of a nice cup of tea. It's good, but it's Polybius in name only. An homage.
I certainly think there's some truth to Polybius. Lots of random arcades have been used as test beds for legendary unreleased arcade games, such as Marble Madness 2 and Primal Rage 2. And several other unreleased games have also been spotted in the background of old news reports, so Polybius could have easily been one of those. What I don't buy is the whole governmental conspiracy behind it. I mean, why would the FBI want to test a machine that makes people nauseous, not only in public, but also on children? I mean, what possible benefit could they have from giving kids migraines? If they really wanted to make kids feel sick, all they needed to do was wait 10 years for Nintendo to invent the Virtual Boy.
So despite all the promises and these fan-made interpretations, nothing resembling a Polybius ROM has ever surfaced. A few fan-made versions and some screenshots of dubious origin are all that exist in the digital domain. But arcade machines are physical things. So what about any physical evidence? Of course, the original story tells of the machine's sudden disappearance. But what if one unit was forgotten? What if they weren't destroyed, but sequestered in some warehouse? What if someone found one? Well, there are some who claim they have. The videos all follow a familiar pattern. A shaky camera led by rumours of Arcade Hall, to the reveal, a dark cabinet bearing a familiar name. Some even feature gameplay. Normally it's just the Rogue Synapse version, but sometimes it's something original. And then, just as things are getting interesting... What was that? Jump scare. Roll credits. Invariably, it's arcade enthusiasts showing off their custom cabinet work and having a bit of fun in the process. And who can blame them? Polybius is an essential part of arcade myth, and to have your own machine is quite the talking point. Only one Polybius cabinet is unaccounted for. A low-resolution black and white photo that appears on the Killer List of Video Games entry for Polybius. It's a Namco-style cabinet dating from about 1979 to 1981. You can see the same style in Galaxian, Galaga, or Pac-Man examples. The black panels and T-molding most strongly suggest a Galaga cabinet with the decals removed. But the sides appear to be lighter, perhaps white, which means it could be the rarer Bosconian or a converted Bosconian cabinet. The controls don't match, however, just a single button and stick. And the coin box isn't consistent with Namco machines of that era. It is period correct, definitely from the early 80s, but the dual steel plate style is more likely to be from a Data East or Nichibutsu machine. So it could be a custom build, repainted and assembled from spares, or even built from scratch. There's also the very real possibility that it's simply a Photoshop. The Polybius marquee could have been applied directly from the screenshot. The low resolution and lack of colour make detecting a fake difficult, and I suspect it's deliberate. An original photo of a custom cabinet, perhaps, but it seems altered to fit the myth. It's not just cabinets. Sometimes someone will claim to have a circuit board from the fabled game, such as the one featured here. If it were real, it might even be playable with the right connections, or the ROMs could be dumped and subsequently emulated. It would be a very valuable find, if it were real. This is definitely an arcade PCB, but it's not Polybius. It's a bootleg Ms. Pac-Man with some minor photoshopping to obfuscate its origin. It's not even enough to fool Google's reverse image search, so we can confidently ignore this particular claim. Manufacturing an arcade game is something which involves a lot of people. Engineers, programmers, artists. It's not a task undertaken solo. So, with multiple people involved, surely by now, someone would have come forward with information. Well, as it happens, there have been a few. Although whether they tell convincing stories is another matter. One testimony comes from an anonymous source who claims Polybius was associated with Sega's arcade division. He's known only as PRG-017.
I know I will not be believed, but still, I believe this must be told. I have information on a video game called Polybius. This game is real. I was a programmer in Sega's arcade division.
They play the myth straight, insisting that their secret project was designed to stimulate specific parts of the human brain, with testers suffering amnesia and loss of arcade game fandom. They then go on to explain that the Sega Genesis CD made use of Polybius code fragments in order to get the two processors syncing up. The account is poorly written and loose on real detail. It leans rather too heavily on the original myth, and the introduction of a link to Sega doesn't seem to make much sense. The technical details are vague, and the timeline doesn't quite match up. The Sega CD wasn't released until 1991, a decade after Polybius. Given the overly dramatic ending, unverified status, and complete lack of supporting evidence, PRG-017 is a fraud. Perhaps the most prominent claimant of responsibility is a man named Stephen Roach, who, in a series of posts in early 2006, claimed to be one of the original programmers of Polybius.
I think it's about time I lay this to rest. My name is Stephen Roach. Cinesolution was a company set up by myself and several other amateur programmers in 1978.
He says he's primarily based in the Czech Republic, where he set up a company called Cinesolution with several mainly amateur programmers that worked on component parts for PCBs, with programming as a limited but very profitable sideline. Interesting how a band of several programmers saw programming as a sideline, but anyway, he goes on to detail the beginning of Polybius.
We were approached around 1980 by a Southern American company that shall remain nameless for legal purposes, to develop an arcade game that centered around a new approach to video game graphics.
So, a Czech company that specialized in PCBs was approached by an unnamed Southern American company to develop an arcade game which would be tested in a limited North American market. Truly a global conspiracy. He goes on to explain how the side effects started happening early in playtesting, and how the resultant cover-up might have inspired the stories of Men in Black. I'll be honest, the writing smacks of impostorship. It's all recounted in run-on sentences dressed in dramatic language that wouldn't be out of place in a poorly written ghost story, and several things just don't add up. He claims to have been born in Rhyl in Wales, and moved to Czechoslovakia in 1965 at the age of 15 due to his parents' business interests. An interesting proposition, given the fact that the country was under communist control at the time. He claims the Polybius name was chosen by one of his colleagues who studied Greek mythology, but Polybius is a historical figure, not a mythological one. The majority of his ramblings are just expansions of the original myth, and what little novel detail exists is presented without proof. I reached out to him via his email address, but received no reply. He did reply to an interview call from BitParade Co. UK, however, where he answered some questions about his role in making the game. Disappointingly, much of it is copied verbatim from his original post. Perhaps he wanted to keep his story straight, or didn't want to expend too much creative effort in developing the story. He does go into more detail about the gameplay, however, describing the puzzle elements that would later influence Rogue Synapse's interpretation of the game. In Kat Despera's 2012 article, Reinvestigating Polybius, she found a possible link between Stephen Roach and the Czech Republic. Someone with that name was running a troubled teen facility in Brno. However, this Stephen Roach was originally a policeman from Utah, whereas the one associated with Polybius claims to have been born in Wales, so perhaps it's just a coincident name. Everything about Stephen Roach reeked of a hoax. I had one lead left to follow. The original claims were made on a few different sites, but Roach was most active on the Retro Gamer forums, where there are a number of follow-up posts. The thread goes on for several pages. A few suspiciously new accounts are quite active. It seems someone might have been using sock puppets to fuel discussion. Later, a moderator confirms that several names are posting from the same IP, and Stephen Roach is amongst them. Most of these accounts were created specifically for the ruse, but the oldest had been used in good faith. I checked the post history, an introduction. I had the prankster's full name and an approximate location. A quick Google search turned up social media accounts that matched. I sent him a tweet and waited. I originally said that I received no reply from Stephen Roach via email, and this was true at the time of writing, and up until a few days after I sent this tweet. As if by magic, 2.5 months after sending the original email, he finally gets back to me. I was approaching the end of this project. I didn't have time for his games. I had to call his bluff. So I addressed him by his real name. I said, perhaps it's time to retire the Stephen Roach persona. It was a long shot, and it didn't work. He kept up the pretense. Even in the face of the evidence I had, he wasn't going to give it up. Shortly after, I received a reply on Twitter from my suspect. My original inquiry was polite, pretty straightforward, but the response was obtuse, hostile even. I wasn't going to get a confession, but by now I was fairly sure I'd found the guy responsible. Let there be no doubt, Stephen Roach is a red herring, and his story entirely fabricated.
Most of what we know about Polybius comes second-hand, and this lack of primary evidence makes me suspicious of the whole thing. However, what we do have is primary evidence for real events that are a bit like some of the things that happened in the Polybius legend. And it's quite easy to see how this could have been embellished or misunderstood to create the Polybius story in these second-hand accounts as they're retold. History isn't necessarily what happened, it's what people say happened.
So, there's a lot of evidence wrapped within the Polybius myth, but not much of it is convincing. The same stories crop up time and time again, sometimes with embellishment, sometimes with new theories, but never anything that links the game to its supposed origin in the arcades. Making